There is a moment in history where forests become tombs without knowing it, where the earth remembers what the world forgets. And in April of 1945, such a moment settled quietly over a stretch of pine woodland south of Berlin, mist gathering between the dark trunks, waiting for something that couldn't be stopped. Imagine, if you will, the quality of light before dawn in a landscape of sandy tracks and thick forest, the kind of landscape where sound carries strangely, not far, but deep, into the soft earth and needles underfoot. Above this place, somewhere beyond the immediate reach of sight, the sky itself trembles with a distant and relentless percussion. Not rain, not thunder in the natural sense, something older than nature's rhythms, something made by human hands firing across kilometers of open country, the concussions arriving as much through the ground as through the air. One learns to feel such sounds as much as hear them. The mist moves slowly through the pine trunks. It doesn't disperse as morning mist often does. It lingers, as though reluctant to leave, and in that lingering, we find ourselves standing in a place that was about to become something that neither Berlin nor Moscow had entirely planned for: a pocket, a cauldron, as the soldiers who lived through it would later say, a place where more than 500,000 exhausted, desperate, hungry men would find themselves trapped between two armies, each one determined to end the other, and the forest itself standing mute witness to what survival looked like when rescue seemed impossible. But before we move deeper into that moment, before we follow the tracks into the tree line and listen to the voices of those who marched through this landscape toward an uncertain fate, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you've ever found yourself drawn to the true stories of the Second World War, particularly those corners of it that history whispers rather than shouts. The stories of last stands and desperate breakouts, of ordinary soldiers facing choices that had no good answer, of landscapes that hold more history than the books always capture. There's something quieting about understanding these moments carefully, accurately, without rushing through them. And here, in this pocket south of Berlin, is one of the most forgotten and most human of them all. The forest at this hour, and we might imagine it as that suspended time just before the full light of day breaks through the canopy, feels almost separate from the war that surrounds it. The birds, those that haven't abandoned the region, sing their small, unconcerned songs. A rabbit moves through the low scrub without fear, because rabbits cannot understand that this particular forest, in this particular spring, is about to become a place where men will kill each other in thickets so dense that they can barely see 5 paces ahead, where vehicles will become stuck in sand and mud, and where the question of survival or death often comes down to which path one chooses through the trees, and how quickly one's legs can carry one forward. The mist that hangs here at dawn carries something in it beyond mere moisture. It carries the quality of a landscape in transition. The old Germany, the Reich that had imagined itself eternal, is collapsing inward toward its capital. The Soviets advance from the east in waves, their armies vast and relentless. And here, in this forest, caught between them, is an army that no longer has a clear command, that no longer understands what victory might mean, that is beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that it might need to fight for nothing more noble than the chance to surrender to the Americans rather than to the Russians. Listen to the silence of this place, if you will. In the actual history of warfare, silence during a war is often more frightening than noise. Noise means the enemy is far enough away to announce himself. Silence means something else entirely. Silence means uncertainty. It means that at any moment, the forest might reveal its secrets, and those secrets are men, exhausted men, hungry men, men who are moving through the trees because their commanders have ordered them to move, or because they've decided on their own that movement is the only remaining form of hope. The sandy soil beneath the pines absorbs sound differently than hard ground. A column of soldiers moving through such a forest doesn't announce itself with the clear rhythm of boots on stone. Instead, there is a softer, more insidious sound, a rustling, a shuffling, the creak of equipment, the occasional murmured order. To a Soviet listener, stationed in a blocking position somewhere to the north or west, The forest would have sounded like it was slowly waking to something it didn't welcome. The mist makes distance difficult to judge. What seems far away might be close. What seems nearby might be kilometers distant. This has always been the particular psychology of forest warfare, the flattening of perspective, the way in which the immediate and the distant become confused. A group of soldiers moving through such conditions cannot easily gauge how many of the enemy surround them, or whether a path leads to escape or into a trap. They move forward because the order has been given, or because they've decided that moving is better than waiting. The forests of Brandenburg have seen many armies move through them over the centuries, but few have moved through in quite this condition: surrounded, cut off, hunted, and increasingly desperate. The distant thunder of guns continues. It doesn't stop. This is something that must be understood about warfare in 1945 on the Eastern Front. The artillery fire is nearly ceaseless. It is the constant backdrop to everything else. It sets the tempo of the day, of sleep, of thought itself. When one lives within such a soundscape long enough, it begins to feel like the natural state of things. When it stops, that is when something strange has happened. That is when peace seems, paradoxically, like a kind of violence itself. Here in this forest, in this mist, in this hour before full dawn, men who were soldiers are beginning to understand that they have become something else. They have become survivors, and survival, in the context of this particular moment, in this particular place, means finding a way through the trees, finding a way west toward the Elbe, finding a way away from the Soviets, whose artillery is drawing closer with each passing hour. They don't yet know what their journey will cost. They don't yet know about the days that will follow in the forest, the battles in thickets so dense that death and life are separated by a distance of only meters. They know only that they are here, that the order to move westward has been given, and that the forest, whatever it might conceal, is the only path forward. The mist hasn't lifted. It settles deeper as the eastern sky begins its long transition from black to grey. This is the moment when a new day is being born, and with it, a new chapter in a story that the forest has been holding for centuries, waiting for this particular spring, this particular moment, this particular tragedy, to move through its trees and leave its marks upon the earth that will take decades to fade. The mist is lifting now, very slowly. In the distance, the thunder continues. But here, in this particular corner of Brandenburg, on the last days of April in 1945, what we're witnessing is something that history books often compress into a single paragraph, if they mention it at all. It's called the Halbe Pocket, and what that means, in the most human and immediate sense, is this. Imagine an entire army, tens of thousands of soldiers, along with the remnants of a civilian population, trying to flee the advancing Soviet forces, suddenly finding themselves surrounded, trapped, with no clear way home, with communications failing, with fuel running out, and with the knowledge that the capital they were supposed to be defending was already falling. The word pocket itself is almost clinical, isn't it? Military terminology has a way of making catastrophe sound orderly, manageable. But a pocket is what happens when the front line collapses so completely that an entire force finds itself cut off from supply lines, from command, from any realistic hope of reinforcement. It's an encirclement, and unlike some of the other pockets that formed on the Eastern Front in those final months of the war, this one was different, because the men trapped here weren't just soldiers, they weren't just military units trying to break through to safety. They were an exhausted, desperate amalgamation of Wehrmacht regulars, SS men still clinging to ideology, Hitler youth boys who'd never fired a rifle in anger before, elderly Volkssturm militia with memories of the First World War, and civilians, so many civilians, all compressed into the same forest, all trying to move west, all terrified of what would happen if they fell into Soviet hands. This is where the story becomes something more than statistics, more than casualty figures or order of battle diagrams, because the Halbe Pocket represents, in many ways, the final spasm of the German collapse on the Eastern Front. It's where the fantasy of the Nazi state encountered reality in its most brutal, and undeniable form. And it's also a place where tens of thousands of ordinary people, many of them boys really, and old men, made the choice to attempt something that seemed almost impossible: a breakout, a westward rush through Soviet positions, through dense forest and broken terrain, toward the hope of reaching the American lines beyond the Elbe River. The story of Halbe has been somewhat overshadowed by the larger narrative of Berlin's fall. When we think of April 1945, we think of the Red Army fighting through the streets of the capital, of Hitler in his bunker, of the final apocalyptic scenes in the Reich Chancellery. And all of that was happening, yes, simultaneously. But while those events were unfolding in the rubble of Berlin itself, this other tragedy was playing out just to the south. This other breakout, this other desperate attempt to escape an army that had every reason to want revenge. If you've ever wondered about the corners of World War II that rarely make it into the mainstream documentaries, if you felt curious about the smaller stories that somehow get lost between the grand narratives, the personal testimonies of ordinary soldiers facing impossible choices, the experiences of civilians caught between two collapsing armies, the geography and tactics that shaped events almost nobody remembers anymore, then there's something here worth your attention. These are the forgotten corridors of history, the moments that shaped how Europe rebuilt itself, and the region itself still carries the marks of that spring. If you'd like to continue this journey into the quieter, more accurate corners of the Second World War, the ones that rarely make the headlines but shaped everything that came after, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. Because these stories deserve to be told carefully, with detail and respect, rather than rushed through or sensationalized. So let us return now to late April 1945, to that moment just after the Soviet forces have completed their encirclement, just after the realization has sunk in that there is no reinforcement coming, that Berlin itself is falling, and that the only choice left is to move, to fight, to try. The forest is waiting. The tracks are muddy, the Soviet guns are in position, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, beyond the trees and the broken villages and the streams swollen with spring melt, the Elbe River waits. Not as a destination, perhaps, but as a symbol, a line drawn between one world and another, between the war that was ending and whatever comes next. By the time winter turned to spring in 1945, the shape of Germany's fate had become almost geometrically clear to anyone who could read a map. The Eastern Front, which had once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea in a jagged line of trenches and fortifications, was no longer a line at all. It had become a series of shrinking islands, pockets of desperate resistance surrounded by seas of Soviet armor that seemed, to those caught within them, absolutely inexorable. The Red Army, having absorbed the catastrophic losses of the previous 3 years and rebuilt itself with ruthless efficiency, was moving west with a momentum that no German counterattack could now arrest. In January, the Soviets had launched what historians call the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive coordinated push that began along the Vistula River in Poland and swept westward in great rolling waves. This was not a local operation or a probing attack. It was a strategic avalanche. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, and Marshal Ivan Konev, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, had been given orders by Stalin himself to reach the Oder River, the last major water barrier before Berlin, and to do so with whatever force was necessary. And they had succeeded. By late January, Soviet spearheads had reached the Oder at multiple points, establishing bridgeheads on the western bank. The distance to Berlin itself was now measured in dozens of kilometers rather than hundreds. For the first time in the war, the German capital was within striking distance of Soviet artillery. The German High Command, such as it still was, had been forced into a posture of pure reaction. The Wehrmacht's reserves were exhausted. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, had largely ceased to exist as a meaningful force. The Eastern Front, which had consumed German military resources with the appetite of an endless furnace, could no longer be reinforced from any other theatre, not because reinforcements didn't exist elsewhere, but because any unit sent eastward would simply prolong the agony rather than alter the outcome. And so the High Command made a choice, or perhaps a series of choices born of desperation, that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men and reshape the final geography of the war in Germany. Army Group Center, the vast formation that still nominally controlled much of Prussia and eastern Brandenburg, was ordered to hold its position at almost any cost. The logic, if one could call it that, was strategic rather than tactical. If the front collapsed entirely, Soviet forces would pour into Berlin unchecked, and the capital would fall. Therefore, certain key positions had to be held. The Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Busse, was positioned south and southeast of Berlin, holding a line that stretched from the Oder downstream toward what would become the Halbe Pocket. Busse's forces were composed of whatever the German military could scrape together at this stage of the war: regular Wehrmacht divisions, many of them under strength and exhausted, SS units, still fanatical but also depleted, and increasingly, units of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, composed of old men and Hitler Youth boys who had been conscripted in the final desperate mobilization. The Ninth Army was, in the parlance of military history, in an impossible position. It held a long, thin line with forces that were inadequate for the task. Behind it lay Berlin and the remnants of German political authority. Before it lay the massed strength of the Soviet offensive, which had already achieved such overwhelming superiority in men and material that the notion of stopping it seemed almost like a discussion among children about halting the tide. The Soviet forces opposite Busse numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their exact composition and strength would only become fully clear in hindsight, but contemporaries understood that they faced odds of perhaps 3 or 4 to 1, perhaps more, in artillery and armor, and the Soviet High Command had no interest in allowing this position to remain stable. Through February and into March, Soviet reconnaissance probes began testing the Ninth Army's defenses with increasing boldness. These were not casual attacks, but deliberate jabs designed to locate weak points and pin down German reserves. German commanders understood what was coming. There would be, at some point in the spring, a major Soviet offensive aimed at breaking through the Ninth Army's line, encircling Berlin, and potentially cutting off Army Group Center entirely from any possibility of withdrawal or relief. The question was not whether such an offensive would come, but when, and from which direction, and with what force. And the deeper question, the one that kept German officers awake in their headquarters, was whether there was any strategic response available that was not simply a variation on the theme of surrender. In early April, the answer became clear in the most brutal way. Soviet forces launched the Seelow Heights offensive north of the Ninth Army's sector, breaking through the defenses protecting Berlin's eastern approaches. Simultaneously, forces under Marshal Konev began their own breakthrough operations south of the capital, driving toward the gaps between Army Group Center and other German formations. The Ninth Army, catching these hammer blows on its northern flank and feeling the pressure building along its entire front, began to receive increasingly frantic orders from higher command. The orders were contradictory by necessity: hold at all costs, but prepare to withdraw; defend the approaches to Berlin, but do not abandon the territory to the rear; maintain contact with neighboring armies, but defend your own sector, regardless of their movements. The trap began to close with an almost inevitable slowness that, paradoxically, was faster than anyone had anticipated. Soviet forces poured through the breaches in the line north of the Ninth Army, racing westward. Other Soviet armies, driving from the south and east, began to curve around toward the gaps between German formations. Within days, it became clear to commanders on the ground that the Ninth Army was no longer defending a line. It was being surrounded. The pocket was forming, not as a deliberate encirclement, but as a consequence of the entire German position in the east, collapsing simultaneously. The Ninth Army's soldiers, many of whom had been in Russia since 1941, were beginning to realize that they might never see their homes again, or at least not as living men. The forest south of Berlin, with its sandy tracks and its mist in the early mornings, was becoming a place where history would make a final, terrible stand. The land itself, before we speak of armies and ambition, demands our attention. The Spreewald, a name that carries within it the quiet dignity of its geography, spreads across the Brandenburg Plain like an intricate nervous system of water and forest. It is not a wilderness in the dramatic sense. Rather, it is a landscape of surprising intimacy, where the Spree River divides and subdivides into countless channels, creating islands of varying size within a matrix of birch and pine. To stand there in April, even now, is to sense how close the trees draw you inward, how the water moves without urgency, how sound becomes muffled and distant becomes uncertain. The forest floor is sandy, pale, punctuated by pools that reflect the sky when the mist clears. Ferns unfurl in the shadows. Moss softens the forest's edges. The town of Halbe itself sits not at the center of this wetland tapestry, but as a kind of gateway, a modest settlement where the forest begins to thin, where several roads converge, a fact that would prove far less reassuring than it might have seemed on maps drawn in Berlin. In peacetime, Halbe was the sort of place that held no particular drama. A railway line passed through it. Local administrators managed its modest affairs. Farmers worked the cleared land beyond the forest's margin. A brick church stood in the town centre, unremarkable but solid. A few modest inns. The kind of German small town that had existed in much the same form for centuries, its rhythms dictated by harvest and market day and the slow turning of seasons. To understand how geography shapes catastrophe, one must think less about roads than about what roads cannot do. The Spreewald, in its fullness, is passable, yes, but not easily. Water requires crossing. The forest requires navigation. A large army moving through such terrain cannot move as one body. It must fragment into columns, into smaller units, strung along the forest tracks like beads on a string. The very character of the landscape that had sheltered generations of local people, that had slowed erosion and preserved the water table, and allowed a quiet rural life to flourish, would become a trap when that landscape had to accommodate tens of thousands of desperate men and vehicles in flight. Consider also the broader geography that enclosed this forest. To the north and east lay the flatter plains approaching Berlin itself, now subject to Soviet artillery concentrations that pounded day and night. To the south, the Spreewald's more open margins gave way to terrain that offered neither cover nor coherent defensive positions. To the west, toward which any German escape would necessarily aim, lay the Elbe River, still more than 60 kilometers away, across country that would have to be contested, town by town, forest section by forest section. The Spreewald, in short, occupied a particular kind of unlucky geography, isolated enough to be surrounded, but not fortified enough to withstand determined assault, dense enough to conceal movement, but too intricate to allow rapid retreat. It was terrain made for guerrilla warfare, for small bands exploiting local knowledge, not for the organized retreat of an entire field army under pressure. What makes geography shape human events, of course, is not the land itself, but how people move across it when stakes become desperate. The Spreewald's network of forest tracks, many of them ancient, had been adequate for local traffic, for loggers, for farmers moving between fields. A heavy armored vehicle bogged down easily on sandy soil, made soggy by spring thaw and recent rain. Wheeled transport, even if fuel had not been scarce, would find itself constrained to certain paths that Soviet observers would quickly learn to target. Tank columns, by contrast, cannot navigate dense woodland at all. They require roads, or at least open terrain, where treads can grip and engines can maneuver. This meant that German armor, to the extent it remained operational and available to the Ninth Army, would be largely immobilized once the decision to move through the Spreewald was made. Infantry could move through the forest where vehicles could not. But infantry without supporting fire is fragile. Infantry exhausted, as we shall see the men of the Ninth Army were becoming, moves slowly. The seasonal moment matters too. April in Brandenburg is a month of transition, unstable weather, Snow can still fall in the early weeks, though by late April the ground softens. Rain turns the sandy forest paths into mud. Streams and channels that are passable when frozen or dry become obstacles when swollen with snowmelt. The Spreewald in late April 1945 was a landscape of thawing, of wet soil and cold nights, of forests still largely bare, which meant less cover than a soldier might hope for, though still enough darkness under the canopy to conceal movement from aerial observation. The roads that did connect the forest settlements, Halbe, Baruth, some dozen other small villages whose names would become burned into the memory of those who fought there, these roads were notably narrow by the standards of German military engineering. They were country roads, built for modest traffic. They could not sustain the weight of a sustained military movement without degradation, and once degraded, they became not merely slow passages, but concentrating factors, pinch points, where large numbers of men and vehicles would inevitably bunch, become vulnerable, create targets. If we imagine the sensibility of a German staff officer in early April, trying to plot the movements of an entire army on maps, the Spreewald presents itself as a problem disguised as a solution. Yes, it offers cover. Yes, its complexity makes it difficult for an enemy to predict precisely where units will emerge. But that same complexity, that same density of forest and water, means that an army moving through it cannot move decisively. Its columns will stretch out, communication between units will become uncertain, the forest will break the army into fragments. And once fragmented, those fragments are easier to hunt. Perhaps no one in the German High Command fully grasped, in the abstract, how profoundly the Spreewald's geography would constrain and ultimately doom the Ninth Army's escape attempt. Maps are not terrain. Lines drawn on paper do not capture the resistance of mud, the disorientation of dense woodland, the hunger and fear that accumulate in men forced to move for days without sleep. Maps cannot convey what it feels like to march through a forest you do not know, while behind you and ahead of you, and to your sides, Soviet guns search for your position. The landscape, in other words, was not neutral. It was a factor in what was coming, not determinative, for human decisions and human courage and human failure always matter, but profoundly constraining. Geography does not make history, but it channels it. It slows some possibilities and accelerates others. It creates moments where chance assumes a particular weight. The Spreewald, with its intimate mixture of water and forest, its network of local roads inadequate to their terrible purpose, its situation equidistant from multiple Soviet armies closing toward a center, this landscape would become the stage for something that the maps in Berlin had not quite anticipated, not in its full human dimension. And as the men of the Ninth Army began their movement into that forest, most of them would have had little sense of the geography they were entering, little conception of what those sandy, waterlogged tracks would demand of them. The man who would hold the Halbe Pocket together, or perhaps more honestly, hold it as it came apart, was General Theodor Busse, a professional soldier of the old Prussian school who had somehow survived the chaos of the Eastern Front longer than most. He was 54 years old in April of 1945, and he had spent the better part of the previous year watching his army dissolve like morning frost under the relentless advance of Soviet mechanized columns. Busse was not a fanatic. He was not one of the remaining high commanders who still believed in some miraculous reversal of fortune, some last terrible weapon that would reshape the war. What he was, instead, was a soldier of a failing state, facing orders that had already become impossible before they were even written. The Ninth Army itself was a shadow formation by early 1945, though on paper it remained one of Germany's largest remaining field forces. It had been battered across the Vistula, reformed, pushed back against the great Soviet winter offensives, and what remained was a composite of desperate circumstances. There were perhaps 200,000 men under his command at the moment the Vistula-Oder offensive began, though the true figure was always uncertain, always shifting like sand through fingers. They were not the divisions that had crossed into Russia in 1941, with all their vigor and terrible certainty. These were men assembled from whatever reserves could be scraped together from the crumbling Eastern Front. Some were seasoned Wehrmacht regulars, men who had seen years of fighting and carried that exhaustion like a weight they could never set down. Others were Hitler youth, 17 and 18 years old, thin-faced and wide-eyed, having received perhaps a month of training before being fed into the line. And woven through the formations were Volkssturm units, older men in their 50s and 60s, factory workers and shopkeepers, and former police, given uniforms and told they were soldiers now in this final defense of the Reich. The composition of Bussé's command reflected not military logic but desperation. There were SS units mixed in among the regular Wehrmacht formations, men whose loyalty ran to the Nazi state in ways that regular army officers found both useful and deeply troubling. There were scattered panzer companies, but the tanks were low on fuel even before the encirclement began, and the meaning of armor in the spring of 1945 on the Eastern Front had fundamentally changed. Soviet air superiority meant that moving any substantial armor in daylight was an act of faith. And beneath all of these formal units was something harder to quantify, a sense of ending, a knowledge that was almost too large to carry. The exhaustion that Bussé's men carried was not merely physical, though that too was absolute. Most of the regular soldiers had been in continuous combat or movement for months. Sleep came in fragments, and often in cold. The supply situation had become increasingly theoretical as the Soviet offensive had begun. Ammunition was rationed, food was thin. The coffee, when it existed at all, was made from roasted grain and chicory, something warm, but not sustaining. What sustained men was habit, training, and in some cases, fear of what would happen if they stopped moving forward. The average German soldier on the Eastern Front by this late stage knew, with a certainty that lived beneath words, that the war was over. The only question was how it would end for each individual man, and that question was becoming more urgent every day. It was into this landscape of exhaustion and unspoken knowledge that the impossible orders came filtering down from Berlin. Hitler's bunker, now sealed and increasingly disconnected from any meaningful understanding of ground conditions, was issuing directives that assumed facts no longer in existence. The Ninth Army was ordered to hold its positions along the Oder. It was ordered to prepare for a counterattack northward toward Pomerania. It was ordered to prevent any Soviet breakthrough toward Berlin. These orders were not merely difficult, they were phantasms. The Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had already broken through in multiple places. The idea that a formation as battered as Bussé's Ninth Army could somehow stabilize the front and mount a counterattack belonged to a version of reality that no longer existed, if it had ever existed at all. Busse himself was a man caught in the permanent tension between military obedience and the knowledge of what was actually possible. He was old enough to remember when the German army was genuinely formidable, when orders from high command reflected real strength and careful calculation. He was living through a time when those orders had become almost random, the fantasies of a government whose leadership was living in an increasingly separated reality. The generals on the Eastern Front in early 1945 were not monolithic in their response to this situation. Some, like Heinrici commanding Army Group Vistula, were beginning to develop ideas about how to preserve their forces and eventually negotiate a surrender. Others remained committed to the Nazi state, with a faith that no amount of evidence could shake. Busse occupied a more complicated position. He would follow orders, he would fight as long as he was commanded to fight, but he was also a practical man, and practical men knew, in the quiet places of their consciousness, what the mathematics of the situation meant. The men of the Ninth Army knew it too, though they knew it differently. A regular infantryman had no access to strategic maps or intelligence briefings. What he knew came from the men around him, from rumor, from observation. He could see that the replacements coming from the rear were fewer and younger. He could feel in the movements of his command that something had shifted toward panic. He could sense in the radio traffic, in the sudden urgency of orders that had before been routine, that Berlin was frightened. And a soldier who can feel fear radiating down from his high command is a soldier who has already begun to understand that the old world is ending. Bussy's order of battle in those days reflects something of this chaos. The Ninth Army consisted nominally of several corps and numerous divisions, though the actual strength of any given division varied wildly. A full-strength German division in 1945 might be called, optimistically, 8 to 10,000 men. Most of Bussy's divisions had been worn down to perhaps 3 or 4,000, sometimes less. The gap between official organization and actual combat power was a chasm that no amount of paperwork could bridge. Officers filled in reports that reflected what they were supposed to have, rather than what they actually commanded. Berlin processed these reports and issued orders based on them, and the disconnect between reality and expectation grew wider with each passing day. The supply lines that were supposed to support the Ninth Army were themselves dying. Rail connections to the east were being cut or disrupted almost daily by Soviet sabotage and air attack. The German army of 1945 had lost the capacity for rapid motorized supply that had once been one of its defining characteristics. Trucks were few, fuel was fewer, and the roads of eastern Germany in April were becoming less reliable as a passage, and more a kind of gauntlet where any vehicle moving in daylight risked attack from the Soviet Air Force. Bussy and his staff knew this. The men of the Ninth Army could feel it. And yet the orders from Berlin continued to assume a functioning state, a coherent military machine, a future in which positions would be held and ground recovered. Yet while the Ninth Army waited in its exhausted readiness, something vast was already closing around it, a movement so immense that no single German officer could see its full shape from any one vantage point. The Soviet formations, two enormous fronts under the command of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Ivan Stepanovich Konev, were executing what may have been one of history's most methodical encirclements, a slow, grinding compression of space and possibility that would tighten day by day until the German soldiers found themselves not in a retreating army, but in a pocket, a surrounded thing. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what was moving across the frozen and thawing ground in those early days of April. Zhukov's first Belarusian front, nearly 2 million men when you gathered all its rifle divisions, armor and artillery into your mind, was driving westward from the Oder toward Berlin itself, following the same axis that the German advance had taken in 1941, but now moving in the opposite direction, heavy with the weight of 4 years of accumulated Soviet doctrine and steel. Konev's first Ukrainian front, to the south, was wheeling north and northwest, its spearheads already pushing deep into Silesia and toward the Elbe, trying to prevent any German force from consolidating to the south of Berlin or from linking up with relief formations from the west. These were not small maneuvers. These were army groups operating across fronts 100 kilometers wide, their movements coordinated not by telephone, radio discipline was strict, but by careful planning, done days or weeks before, by liaison officers traveling between headquarters, by the accumulated experience of commanders who had learned their trade in the wreckage of Stalingrad and Kursk. The Ninth Army, General Theodor Bussy's formation, sat precisely in the angle where these two fronts were converging. Its northern flank faced Zhukov's advancing columns coming from the Oder. Its southern flank faced elements of Konev's mobile formations sweeping around from the southwest. And west of it, west, toward Berlin and the promise of reinforcement, lay Soviet armor and motorized rifle divisions that had already pushed beyond the German defensive positions and were moving to establish blocking lines against any attempt at breakout or relief. The German staff officers in the Ninth Army's command posts began to sense the trap forming around the first week of April, though the exact moment when certainty replaced hope varies in the accounts. Radio reports came in from forward positions, increasingly fragmentary as Soviet advances disrupted communications. Divisional commanders radioed urgent requests for instructions that either never came or came countermanded by messages from Berlin that seemed divorced from the reality these men were observing. The isolation, when it came, was not announced with a ceremony. It arrived as a growing silence, as radio frequencies going dead, as a realization that spread through the officer corps like a chill. The roads to the west were no longer open, or rather, they were becoming less open by the hour as Soviet mechanized columns moved to seal them. Think of what it must have felt like for a regimental commander, perhaps a man in his middle 50s who had survived the entire Russian campaign, to realize that the headquarters he had been receiving orders from was now unreachable, that the connection to Berlin, to Hitler's bunker, to whatever authority still claimed to command German forces, had been severed not by signal failure, but by Soviet tanks sitting astride the roads. The psychological moment when a soldier ceases to be a member of a retreating army and becomes instead a member of an encircled formation is profound. It is the moment when possibility contracts, when the map on the wall ceases to be a guide and becomes instead a prison diagram. The exact timing of when the Ninth Army understood itself to be wholly cut off depends partly on which unit you ask and partly on how you define encirclement. In the strict military sense, an army is encircled when enemy forces have established continuous contact around its entire perimeter, which is a neat geometric concept that rarely matches the messy reality of war. In the practical sense that mattered to Busse and his officers, the Ninth Army knew itself to be trapped when direct communication with Army Group Vistula became impossible, and when reconnaissance patrols sent down the roads toward Berlin returned. Those that returned at all, with reports of Soviet armor astride the Autobahn and Soviet infantry in blocking positions in towns that German forces had held only days before. By around the 8th of April, this awareness had hardened into certainty. The Ninth Army was no longer a strategic reserve waiting for orders. It was no longer part of a coherent German defense. It was surrounded, or nearly surrounded, and every hour that passed tightened the perimeter slightly more as Soviet forces systematized and consolidated their positions. Zhukov's spearheads had driven to within perhaps 30 kilometers of Berlin's eastern suburbs. Konev's mobile formations were sweeping around to the south and west, moving toward the Elbe and establishing what amounted to an outer ring around the entire trapped mass of the Ninth Army and the various other German formations, remnants of shattered divisions, Waffen-SS units, Hitler Youth battalions, Home Guard reserves, that had become entangled in the same shrinking space. What happened in those command posts in the first days of true encirclement was a peculiar kind of despair mixed with a strange brittleness of hope. Busse received orders from Berlin, orders that seemed to come from Hitler himself, though they were relayed through intermediaries, to hold the Ninth Army in position and to await a relief offensive by General Walther Wenck's 12th Army, which was supposedly massing to the west and southwest. These orders had an almost dreamlike quality to them. Wenck's 12th Army was real enough, but its strength was vastly overestimated in Berlin, and whether it could even reach the Ninth Army was uncertain. Yet to disobey the orders was to commit what amounted to mutiny in the twilight of the Nazi state, an act with consequences that still mattered in April 1945, when the regime, though dying, still had enough vitality to shoot men who refused orders. The men in the ranks of the Ninth Army, meanwhile, began to sense something had changed in a more immediate and physical way. Supply lines were becoming more irregular, ammunition was arriving in smaller quantities, orders, when they came, seemed to be from multiple, conflicting sources. The sense of a unified command structure was dissolving, and around them, the sound of Soviet artillery, which had been a distant rumble on the eastern horizon, was beginning to come from multiple directions, from north, south, and increasingly from the west as well. The artillery fire was not yet the overwhelming crescendo of a final assault. It was instead a containment, a gradual constriction, Soviet batteries positioned to prevent German movement outward and to grind down German morale through a steady, methodical application of destructive fire. The forests around Halbe grew louder with the sound of war, yet paradoxically quieter in another sense. The roar of organized battle, the noise of mechanized warfare as Germany had waged it in the glory days of Blitzkrieg, gave way to something more fragmented, the crackle of small arms fire through the trees, the thump of mortars, the occasional crash of a shell, but spaces of eerie quiet between these sounds. The old pine forests, which had stood for centuries, now became the defining feature of the Ninth Army's cage. The encirclement was not being established on open plains, where you could see the enemy positions kilometers away. It was being established in woodland, where sight lines were measured in meters rather than kilometers, where Soviet units could move from tree to tree and establish blocking positions that German reconnaissance patrols would stumble upon almost by accident. By the second week of April, the realization had settled into the consciousness of the Ninth Army's command staff with the weight of a sentence. They were trapped. Berlin was falling. Relief was uncertain. And the only course that seemed to offer any possibility of salvation, breaking out to the west through the Soviet ring and linking up with Wenck's 12th Army, was the very thing that Berlin's orders explicitly forbade them to attempt. Bussy was caught between an order from the Führer and the physical reality that surrounded him. The order said, "Hold in place and await relief." The reality said that staying in place meant annihilation. The forests of Brandenburg in April of 1945 held not only soldiers. Beneath the canopy, in the scattered farmhouses and small villages that dotted the Spreewald region, lived the people who had always belonged there, families whose roots ran as deep as the pine trees themselves. For them, the war had been a distant thunder for so long, and then suddenly it was very close indeed, and the thunder had a shape and a direction and two sides. Consider the farmer who woke on certain mornings that spring to find Soviet artillery spotters in his fields, or the widow whose small cottage lay between two forests where German columns were now hiding. These were not strategists or commanders. They were people accustomed to seasons and soil, to the rhythm of planting and harvest, and now they inhabited a space where military necessity and human survival had become entangled in ways that offered no clean resolution. The region had already endured years of upheaval. Refugees had been trickling westward from Poland and the Eastern Territories for months, families who had fled ahead of the Soviet advance, carrying what they could, their carts laden with blankets and photographs, and the irreplaceable objects of ordinary life. They had moved through Brandenburg seeking safety, seeking a place to stop, but safety had become theoretical. Now, as the Ninth Army found itself encircled, these same roads filled again with new refugees, local people understanding dimly, but certainly, that the front line was no longer distant. The front line was coming through their gardens and their wheat fields and their forests. What did it feel like, perhaps we might gently wonder, to be a civilian in this moment? Not the grand moment of strategic collapse, but the intimate moment of hearing unfamiliar voices in your barn. The low, urgent conversations of German soldiers asking for food, for directions, for the location of water. Then, within hours or days perhaps, the arrival of Soviet soldiers with the same requests, framed now in a language that sounded harsh and unfamiliar. The fear was not abstract. It was the fear of your daughter being seen, of your stores of food being taken, of your small wooden house becoming a checkpoint or a bunker or a grave. It was the fear of being caught between forces you could not influence or predict. The historical record of these civilian experiences is sparse and fragmented. Most accounts come from much later, from interviews conducted decades after the war, when memory had smoothed certain edges and sharpened others. A farmer might remember the sound of tanks in the forest more vividly than the date. A woman might remember the face of a terrified boy in a Wehrmacht uniform more clearly than the strategic situation that had put him there. These memories are valuable and real, yet they are also filtered through trauma and time, and we must hold them gently, aware that they are true in their feeling and sometimes uncertain in their detail. There was a particular kind of vulnerability that affected the rural populations. Unlike city dwellers, who could retreat into basements and buildings, farmers and villagers lived in structures scattered across open or semi-open land. Their homes were visible, their wells and barns and livestock made them obvious places for soldiers to stop, and in the chaos of the encirclement, discipline was fraying. Some soldiers behaved with restraint and courtesy, buying or trading for food. Others did not. The boundary between military necessity and depredation was thin and permeable, and civilians could not predict which side of it they would encounter next. The women and older people who remained in the region faced particular dangers. Young men had long since been conscripted. The villages were inhabited largely by those deemed unfit for military service, the very old, the infirm, mothers with young children. There had been rumors, too, spreading through the countryside like a fog, about what the Red Army did when it advanced. Some of these rumors were rooted in documented events. Others were propaganda, inflated to terrify. But in April of 1945, no civilian in Brandenburg could easily separate truth from rumor, and fear operated in the space between them. Yet there was also a strange kind of ordinariness persisting in the midst of chaos. Historians who have examined civilian accounts often remark on this quality, the way that people continued to concern themselves with immediate, practical matters even as the world seemed to be ending. A woman remembered worrying about her cow. A boy remembered being hungry and thinking about bread. These are not trivial details. They are evidence of the human mind's remarkable ability to focus on the manageable when the unmanageable is too vast. It is a form of survival, psychological and perhaps literal. Some civilians did attempt to hide, moving deeper into the forests with whatever they could carry, hoping to wait out the encirclement in the dense woods. The Spreewald's terrain, which would soon become a crucible for the Ninth Army's soldiers, also offered shelter and concealment for the terrified. But the forests, too, were becoming battlegrounds. Artillery shells did not discriminate between soldier and civilian. The wet earth and dark trees offered some protection from view, but not from shells or from hunger, or from the cold that still came in the nights of April. There is a particular kind of trauma that attaches to being caught between two vast military forces, both of which regard you as an obstacle or a resource. You have no agency, you have no clear ally, you have only the hope that the violence will pass you by, and the knowledge that this hope is fragile. In the daylight hours of that spring, this was the condition of thousands of ordinary people in rural Brandenburg. The soldiers, too, were increasingly aware of these civilians. German officers, understanding that their retreat would have to pass through inhabited country, sometimes attempted to organize the evacuation of local populations ahead of advancing Soviet forces. This had both humanitarian and practical motivations. Fewer civilians meant fewer complications, fewer potential accusations of collaboration or sabotage, fewer mouths that could not be fed. But evacuations were chaotic and incomplete. Many people chose or were forced to remain with their homes and possessions, gambling that they could endure what was coming. The historical record preserves some of these stories in fragments. A letter, discovered after the war, written by a farmer to his son at the front. A photograph of a cottage with artillery damage. An account given by a refugee woman to a post-war historian, recorded in a now fragile archive. These pieces do not add up to a comprehensive history of civilian experience in the Halbe Pocket region, but they suggest the texture of it, the fear, the practical ingenuity, the terrible passivity of being a non-combatant at the moment a war came to its end in your garden. When we speak of the Halbe Pocket, we often mean the soldiers, the encirclement, the breakout, the military dimensions, but woven through this narrative, inseparable from it, though often invisible in formal histories, is the story of the civilians who lived there, who watched it happen, who survived it or did not. They inhabited the same forests, the same villages, they breathed the same smoke, and when the guns fell silent and the survivors began to reckon what had occurred, they carried memories that did not fit neatly into any official account. The spring of 1945 was turning towards summer as these events unfolded. The earth was warming. New growth was emerging in the forests. In any other year, this would have been a time of renewal, of planting and hope. But in Brandenburg that year, it was something else entirely, a time suspended between eras, between the war that was ending and a future that could not yet be imagined. The civilians of the region would carry the weight of it for the rest of their lives, not as a grand historical experience, but as a personal, intimate dislocation that had shattered the ordinary rhythms of their world. The radio operators in the command posts south of Berlin were among the first to understand that something had fundamentally shifted. It was the silence, in some ways, that told them what was happening, more than any formal announcement ever could. When you are a soldier, accustomed to the constant chatter of military communications, the crackling requests for artillery support, the updates on supply movements, the tense coordination between adjacent units, the sudden hollowness on the frequencies carries a particular kind of dread. The lines to Army Group Center grew fainter. Then they stopped altogether. It was April 18, 1945, and the Ninth Army, under General Theodor Busse, had begun to realize, unit by unit, that the ring around them had closed. The chaos was not the kind you might imagine from history books, with screaming orders and immediate panic. Instead, it was quieter and perhaps more disorienting. Officers trying to raise their superiors on frequencies that no longer answered. Supply sergeants discovering that the next fuel depot marked on their maps was now in Soviet hands. The messages that did come through from Berlin grew increasingly surreal. High command insisted that relief was coming. A breakthrough was imminent. The 12th Army, under General Walther Wenck, would arrive from the west, it was said, and the encirclement would crumble. These assurances came down through the channels of command with an almost ritualistic quality, even as the men on the ground watched their circumstances narrow with each passing hour. The physical sensation of running out of fuel is peculiar in an army. It is not like hunger, which comes gradually and can be endured with grim determination. Fuel shortage is systemic. A tank that cannot move becomes a bunker. A truck that cannot drive becomes an obstacle. The vehicles that had carried the Ninth Army eastward in desperate counterattacks now sat motionless in forest clearings, their engines silent, their crews sitting on the chassis in the cool April afternoons, with nothing to do but wait and conserve strength. Some were cannibalized for parts. Others were simply abandoned, their fuel drained into jerry cans that might keep a command vehicle running for another few kilometers. The mathematics of retreat are always brutal. Every kilometer westward required precious fuel. Every kilometer westward took them further from Berlin, and Berlin was where they were supposed to be. Ammunition presented a different kind of crisis. The Ninth Army was not short of riflemen. It was not even catastrophically short of artillery pieces. What it lacked was the steady supply of rounds that kept those pieces speaking. Combat inside an encirclement consumes ammunition in ways that linear warfare does not. You are surrounded on multiple sides, which means threats arrive from unexpected directions, and responding to threats requires a profligacy with shells and bullets. Rationing began quietly. Forward observers learned to call for fire only when absolutely necessary. Machine gun crews were limited in their bursts. Riflemen were told to make every round count, which was the sort of order that sounds reasonable in a command post, but carries a particular weight when you are lying in a trench facing Soviet infantry advancing through the trees. The radio traffic during those first days of encirclement, when it could be intercepted by anyone with a receiver, carried an odd mixture of desperation and formality. There were requests for permission to withdraw that were denied or simply not answered. There were reports from unit commanders trying to account for subordinate formations that no longer reported back. There were queries about ammunition levels, fuel reserves, casualty counts. The men who operated the radios, young soldiers often, or older men whose hearing had begun to fail but whose experience made them indispensable, developed a kind of weary routine. They would send a message, wait for a response that might or might not come, and then repeat. The static between transmissions seemed to carry its own kind of information. What would happen to Berlin? This was the question that haunted the command posts and the foxholes alike, though it was never asked aloud in quite those words. The psychological weight of being trapped while the capital itself hung in the balance was unlike anything most of these men had experienced. In an ordinary encirclement, in an ordinary retreat, your focus narrows to immediate survival. But this was not ordinary. Berlin was a few dozen kilometers away. On clear nights, You could sometimes see the distant glow of the bombardment on the northern horizon. The Soviets were closing in from multiple directions. American forces were advancing from the west, though that hardly mattered now that the war had become a race between two specific enemies. How long did the capital have? Days? A week? Would there be anything left to relieve? The uncertainty was, in its own way, as draining as the physical hardship. There was no clear timeline. No one could say with authority how long the Ninth Army would need to hold its ground before Wenck arrived, or whether Wenck would arrive at all, or whether the relief operation existed anywhere outside the desperate hope of high command. This is the peculiar torment of encirclement, more subtle than combat itself. You are not in immediate danger every moment. You are instead in a state of suspended danger, knowing that you are trapped, but not knowing exactly when or how the trap will spring. The nights were perhaps the worst part. As daylight faded over the Spreewald forests, the temperature would drop, and the men would huddle in groups around smokeless fires, because fires could attract artillery. The sounds of the forest changed after dark. Animal sounds and wind sounds became threatening in ways they would not have been in peacetime, and there was the radio, always present, crackling with fragments of communication from other units, some of them growing weaker as the hours passed. Were they running out of battery power, or had the units fallen silent for other reasons? There was no way to know. You simply listened and tried to interpret meaning from incomplete information, which is precisely the condition that erodes morale most quickly. The officers bore this uncertainty with something like resignation. General Busse, the commander of Ninth Army, was a Prussian professional, a man steeped in the military traditions of a state that had been dissolving for months. He had orders from Berlin. Those orders were contradictory and increasingly unmoored from reality, but they were orders nonetheless. He would relay them to his subordinates, and his subordinates would do their best to execute them, and meanwhile the encirclement would tighten. The radio traffic reflected this strange formality. Even as the situation deteriorated, the reports continued to be filed in proper military format, complete with abbreviations and unit designations and the kinds of details that would matter tremendously if there were someone at a headquarters somewhere processing this information strategically. There often was not. Inside the concrete bunker beneath the Chancellery Gardens in Berlin, as April deepened toward its end, a man who had not stepped outside for weeks was issuing orders to armies that no longer answered with certainty. Adolf Hitler, in those final days, held to a map of the Eastern Front that bore less and less resemblance to the actual positions of German units, a common tragedy of command in the final hours of any collapsing power, when distance, noise, and desperate hope conspire to replace geography with wish. The Ninth Army's encirclement was not, in Hitler's understanding, a catastrophe to be accepted or even acknowledged as permanent. It was instead a temporary disruption, a tactical problem with a solution already in motion. Somewhere to the southwest, forming up with the remnants of the 4th Panzer Army, was Walther Wenck's 12th Army, a command that existed, on paper at least, and whose officers Hitler believed capable of the impossible, of driving north through the Soviet lines, relieving Berlin, and freeing the Ninth Army to rejoin the fight for the capital. There is a quality to these final directives worth sitting with, rather than dismissing. They were not madness in the clinical sense. They were something perhaps more human and more tragic. The orders of a commander whose mental model of the world had become separated from the world itself, yet who retained absolute authority over life and death. Wenck was young, energetic, and desperate to believe that salvation was still possible. The Ninth Army's officers, encircled and running out of ammunition, were desperate too. Desperation and belief can move mountains of effort, even when the mountain itself is an illusion. The fantasy, and we might as well name it directly, though as gently as history allows, was that Wenck's army would break through the Soviet encirclement, link up with Ninth Army, and together they would form a relief corridor into Berlin itself. This was not mere optimism. There were actual German units, actual tanks, actual men with rifles in Wenck's command. The question was never whether they existed, but whether they had the strength, the fuel, the air cover, and the fortune to accomplish something that required all four. And the historical record, when we examine it carefully, remains genuinely uncertain about what Wenck himself believed was possible, and what he was simply reporting to Berlin, because reporting anything less felt like failure. Hitler issued the order for the breakout. Or perhaps more accurately, Hitler authorized what had already begun to form in the minds of Ninth Army's officers, a drive westward, away from the collapsing pocket, toward the rumored position of Wenck's forces and, beyond them, the Elbe and the American lines. It was framed as a temporary withdrawal, a regrouping. The language mattered then, as language always matters in moments of collective crisis. Men could accept a fighting withdrawal more readily than they could accept simple abandonment. An ordered retreat toward a relief army is not the same, psychologically, as a desperate rout. The bunker's signals to the Ninth Army became increasingly fragmentary as April wore on. Radio contact was intermittent. The situation map in Berlin showed movements and positions that often had little bearing on where German units actually were. Orders arrived, were received, were sometimes followed, and sometimes simply set aside by company commanders who found themselves making real-time decisions that no distant bunker could make for them. This is the texture of command collapse, not a sudden extinction of authority, but a slow dissolution of the gap between order and obedience, until men in the field begin to act not from explicit instruction, but from their best guess about what survival requires. Wenck himself presents one of those figures in the historical record, about whom we must remain cautious in our interpretation. He survived the war and gave testimony afterward, and like all survivors giving testimony about the intentions and beliefs of dead men, his account carries both genuine recollection and the understandable human tendency to cast one's own actions in a light of greater rationality and less responsibility than perhaps was warranted. Some historians suggest he knew the relief of the Ninth Army was all but impossible, and pursued it anyway, as a matter of honor and obedience. Others suggest he truly believed, for at least some hours, that a breakthrough might be achieved. The honest answer is that we cannot be entirely certain, and it is worth acknowledging that uncertainty rather than collapsing it into a neat narrative. What we can say, with confidence drawn from contemporary records, is that Hitler believed, or insisted, that others believe, that Wenck was coming. That Ninth Army's officers received orders to break out westward toward Wenck's position, that tens of thousands of men began to move through the forest corridors with this hope in their minds, however fragile it might have been. Whether that hope was deserved, whether Wenck's army had any genuine capacity to fulfill it, whether the rescue that eventually did occur was a triumph, or merely the temporary salvation of those who managed to find their way to the American lines. These questions require that we follow the men themselves as they moved through the Spreewald, rather than judging their decisions from the comfort of hindsight. The directives from the bunker, then, were not pure fantasy imposed upon unwilling men. They were rather a shared consensus that the situation, while dire, was not yet lost, that there remained options, that movement westward might lead somewhere other than death or captivity. For soldiers in an encirclement, for men who have already lost their capital and their nation, that shared consensus, however fragile, however untethered from reality, becomes the only ground upon which collective action becomes possible. It is a humbling thing to recognize, as one studies these final weeks of the Eastern Front, how resilient human hope can be, even in circumstances that hope has no rational foundation to rest upon. By the third week of April, as the encirclement tightened around the Ninth Army like a closing fist, the men in the command posts and scattered battalion headquarters began to understand with terrible clarity that Berlin would not be relieved. The radio messages from the Führerbunker had grown more frantic, more divorced from what was actually happening in the forests and villages south of the capital. Orders arrived for relief offensives that no longer had the strength to materialize. Reality and Hitler's directives had become two separate wars entirely. It was in this atmosphere of fracturing orders and dimming hope that General Theodor Busser and his senior commanders faced a choice that was perhaps no choice at all, but it had to be made nonetheless. Held in place by Soviet artillery and encroaching infantry, supplied by whatever could be flown in or gathered from abandoned depots, the Ninth Army could not hold its position indefinitely. The Soviets were bringing up more guns every day. Fuel was almost gone. Ammunition counts were measured now, not in rounds, but in minutes of defensive fire. And beyond all these material facts lay something less quantifiable, but no less real: the psychological certainty that time itself was running out. To break out eastward, toward Berlin, toward the Führer, and the promises of relief, would mean charging directly into prepared Soviet positions. It would mean abandoning any hope of withdrawal and gambling everything on a breakthrough that even the most optimistic estimates suggested might leave 90% of the men dead. This was not merely a military calculation. To move toward Berlin was to move toward the Soviet closing jaws, to surrender any possibility of escape. And by late April, many of the officers and soldiers in that pocket had begun to sense, in the quietest parts of their minds, that survival might matter more than obedience. The westward route presented a different logic altogether, though no less desperate. To move west meant moving toward the Elbe River, toward the zones that the Americans were advancing into, toward the possibility that Wehrmacht and Allied troops might meet somewhere in Saxony or Brandenburg and create a momentary space through which soldiers might flee. It meant moving away from Berlin, yes, but moving away also from Soviet positions that were most densely packed and most prepared. The Elbe was perhaps 50 kilometers distant. The Soviet lines were not uniform. The forests between here and there were dense, confusing, a landscape that favored dispersal and small unit movement over organized Soviet blocking positions designed for open ground. Someone, perhaps Busset himself, perhaps his operations officer, had recognized something about the terrain that would become the foundation of the breakout. The roads were Soviet killing zones, but the tracks through the forest were another matter entirely. A panzer column moving down the Reichsstrasse would be detected, attacked, slowed, and eventually stopped. But men moving through the Spreewald forests in the darkness, in small groups, in the pre-dawn hours when Soviet reconnaissance was weakest, men who knew how to move quietly and scatter when necessary, these men had a chance. It was not a good chance, but it was a chance. The decision crystallized around a question that must have echoed through those command posts. What is the army for, if not to save the lives of its men? The order to defend Berlin to the last man, to hold positions that could not be held, to await relief that would not come. These were directives that belonged to a regime already dead in all ways but the final administrative ones. Busser and his commanders were not rebels, and they would not frame their decision as defiance, but they chose the forest tracks over the roads. They chose westward over eastward. They chose, in effect, to save what could be saved. The breakout would be organized, insofar as organization was possible in a pocket containing perhaps 200,000 men, as a series of convergent movements through the forest, timed to overwhelm specific Soviet blocking positions and create temporary corridors through which the mass of soldiers could pour. The forest paths were narrow, often only wide enough for single file. The tracks were sandy, prone to mud, lined with trees so dense that visibility shrank to yards. A vehicle following a forest track at night, without lights, navigating by memory or maps that were already half wrong, was moving at perhaps 10 kilometers per hour. A marching column took longer still. But therein lay a strange advantage. The Soviets expected a military breakout, an attempt to punch through with concentrated force, vehicles in the lead, infantry following. What they would encounter instead, beginning in the last days of April, was something more like a human tide, dispersing and flowing through the forest, like water finding every gap in a crumbling dam. The soldiers in that pocket, faced with the certainty of annihilation if they stood still, accepted that they had to move, even if movement meant the possibility of being lost in the darkness, separated from their units, wandering in the Spreewald forests without food or compass, or any clear sense of which direction held life and which held death. There was also, in choosing the forest route, a kind of psychological relief. A soldier ordered to defend Berlin to the last round of ammunition, and the last man faces a kind of static horror, the certainty of his own death at a fixed location, waiting passively for the end. But a soldier who is ordered to break out westward, even if the chances are poor, is given back the terrible gift of agency. He is part of a migration, a movement, a human current that is flowing rather than standing still. For men who had been stationary in their foxholes and trenches for days, the prospect of movement, even movement into uncertainty, seemed somehow less intolerable than remaining where they were. The logistics of such a breakout were almost fantastically complicated. How does one feed 200,000 men while they are marching through a forest at night? How does one keep them from scattering completely? How does one maintain any semblance of unit cohesion when the darkness and the trees and the sound of Soviet guns are fragmenting every organizational structure? These were questions for which there were no good answers, only expedient ones. Supply dumps would be established at intervals through the forest. Men would march in columns, spaced thinly, to reduce Soviet artillery's effectiveness. Officers would remain with their units as long as possible, but the implicit understanding was that the formal structure of the army would dissolve in the forest, and what would emerge on the other side, if anything emerged at all, would be something closer to armed migration than organized military movement. There was also the question of what to do with the wounded, the exhausted, the sick. The Ninth Army was not a fresh force. It was a force that had been beaten backward for months, that had retreated from the Vistula, that had been compressed into a pocket and bombarded by Soviet artillery. Many of its men were already suffering from dysentery, frostbite, infected wounds, the grinding exhaustion of combat. How does a man with dysentery and no medical supplies march through a forest for days? How does one transport the wounded through terrain where even vehicles could barely move? The answer, though it was never stated in so many words, was that some of the wounded would not make it. This was a fact that the commanders of the Ninth Army seemed to have accepted with a kind of grim realism. Some lives could be saved, others could not. The goal was to maximize the former and minimize the guilt of the latter. By April 25, when the order to break out westward was finalized and relayed down through the chain of command, the die was cast. The forest tracks were ready. The soldiers were ready, in the sense that anything resembling readiness was possible for men in that situation. The Soviets were closing in, but they could not be everywhere at once. And somewhere to the west, the Americans were advancing, drawing closer every day. The Ninth Army would move toward those Americans through the Spreewald forests, moving at night, dispersing through the trees, accepting that this path would cost lives but believing, or at least hoping, that it would cost fewer lives than standing still. In those days after the realization that the ring had closed, something peculiar and terrible began to happen inside the pocket, a mixing of men that would not have been possible in any other moment of the war. The Wehrmacht soldiers, who had been trained in the old way, found themselves moving through the forest alongside teenagers who had been conscripted into the Hitler Youth military units, boys in some cases no more than 15 or 16 years old, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that should have been in school rather than in combat. These young conscripts had received perhaps weeks of training, some of them barely enough to understand how to strip and clean a rifle. They marched with a kind of stunned resilience, as if the unreality of their situation had created a buffer between them and fear. Mixed among them too were the SS units, the ideologically committed cadre who maintained a different bearing, a rigidity that persisted even as everything around them crumbled. These men were fewer in number than the regular army soldiers, but their presence was felt, their insistence on order and discipline, sometimes pushing the mixed columns forward when exhaustion might otherwise have stopped them. Imagine for a moment the strange chemistry of that enforced proximity, men who had spent years as ideological opponents, now sharing the same forest paths, the same hunger, the same terrifying uncertainty about whether the next dawn would bring artillery fire or a chance to eat. And then there were the Volkssturm, the people's militia, that had been hastily assembled in the final months of the war. These were older men, often in their 50s or 60s, called from civilian life to fight. Shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, farmers who had never expected to wear a uniform again after the First World War, or perhaps had never worn one at all. They moved through the darkness with a particular kind of weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that came not just from lack of sleep, but from the profound dissonance between their civilian memories and the catastrophic present. One can only wonder what thoughts occupied their minds as they trudged forward. Memories of home, of wives waiting for news, of the life that had seemed so permanent only months before. The fundamental condition that bound all these disparate soldiers together was hunger. Not the manageable hunger that comes from missing a meal or two, but the deep, chronic gnawing of calories withheld for days at a time. The Pocket's supply lines had been severed almost from the moment of encirclement, and what little food had been available was quickly consumed. Many of the men moved through the forest with nothing in their bellies for 30, sometimes 40 hours at a stretch. A handful of bread when it could be found, a cup of thin coffee if someone managed to light a fire undetected. The human body, after several days without adequate nourishment, begins to function differently. Thoughts become slow and repetitive. Decision-making becomes difficult. Even fear loses some of its edge, replaced by a kind of numb persistence. Alongside hunger came sleeplessness, though this was a more complicated privation. It was not that rest was forbidden, rather, rest was nearly impossible. The units moved primarily at night to avoid Soviet air observation and artillery spotters, which meant that daylight hours were the only opportunity to sleep, and daylight hours in a forest encirclement were never truly safe. You might lie down for 20 minutes, drifting into a fractured, interrupted state that could barely be called sleep, before a whispered order would come down the line that the column was moving again. Or you might be settling into deeper sleep when distant voices or the sound of tracked vehicles would jolt you awake, adrenaline flooding your system with the thought that the enemy had found you. Sleep became something precious and rare, and the accumulation of its absence created a kind of waking dream state through which men moved. In this condition, hungry, sleep-deprived, moving through darkness in a mixed unit of strangers bound only by geography and circumstance, the ordinary soldier's ability to think clearly or maintain psychological composure began to erode. Veterans from earlier campaigns, men who had fought in France or Russia and survived, sometimes found this encirclement more psychologically disorienting than earlier battles, precisely because the action was so dispersed and invisible. In earlier engagements, there had been clear moments of danger and clear moments of relative safety. Here, in the forests, danger seemed to be present everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A sniper's shot could come from any direction. Soviet patrols could emerge from the dark without warning, and yet there were also long stretches of apparent calm that created a false sense of security. The young conscripts responded to these conditions differently than the older men. Some of them seemed to move through the experience with a kind of numbed compliance, doing what they were told without quite grasping the magnitude of what was happening. Others showed surprising resilience, perhaps partly because they had less long life experience to compare this horror against. The older Volkssturm soldiers, by contrast, often seemed preoccupied with the strangeness of the situation itself, that here they were, in their 50s or 60s, armed and marching through a forest in the middle of a war, when they should have been at home, worrying about whether the harvest would be sufficient or whether the shop would remain solvent. The SS men, the ideologically committed ones, maintained throughout a certain rigidity of purpose. They spoke about breaking out with an almost religious conviction, as if the Führer's will and their own determination alone could punch through Soviet lines and restore order to a world that was catastrophically disordering. To the regular soldiers and the Volkssturm, this rhetoric often seemed hollow, born of a disconnection from the reality of hunger and sleeplessness, and the visible superiority of Soviet artillery. Yet, the SS men's insistence on movement, on forward progress, sometimes became the very thing that kept the columns moving, when everything else argued for collapse and surrender. Units formed and reformed, soldiers attaching themselves to whichever group seemed to be moving most purposefully toward the west. A man might start the night with one company and end it with another, having merged with a larger column or separated from his unit in the darkness. Officers struggled to maintain command structures that barely existed anymore. The formal hierarchy of the military, clear chains of command, defined responsibilities, regular communication between units, had largely evaporated inside the pocket. What remained were clusters of men moving through the forest, their cohesion dependent more on proximity and the personality of whoever seemed to be making decisions than on any formal military organization. Consider the conversation that might have occurred between these men in the rare moments when the columns were halted and no immediate danger seemed to threaten. A Wehrmacht sergeant and a Volkssturm shopkeeper, perhaps, sitting together in the darkness, speaking in low voices so as not to be heard by the soldiers nearby. The sergeant might mention a town where he had been stationed earlier, describing it as it had been in peacetime, almost consciously evoking a world that seemed infinitely distant. The shopkeeper might respond with similar reminiscence, finding in the shared act of remembering a kind of psychological anchor to sanity. And yet both would have been aware, with each word they spoke, of the precariousness of their situation, the way that morning might bring catastrophe, or, if they were fortunate, merely another day of marching and hunger and exhaustion. The physical and psychological strain of these conditions accumulated with each passing hour. Men's judgment deteriorated. Discipline, while maintained by officers and SS personnel, became more fragile as fatigue deepened. The risk of panic, of a sudden break where soldiers simply abandoned their units and ran, was always present. And yet, remarkably, in most cases, the columns held together. Men who had every rational reason to surrender or disperse continued moving forward, driven perhaps by habit, by loyalty to the particular small group immediately around them, or by the dimly understood sense that breaking out of the encirclement represented their only chance of survival. This was the human condition inside the Halbe Pocket, not the condition of clearly delineated armies moving in strategic patterns, but the condition of individual men, mixed and exhausted and starving, moving through dark forests toward an uncertain future, bound together by hunger, sleeplessness, and the strange community that forms between people who share the same desperate hour. By the 24th of April, the village of Halbe itself had become something more than a place on a map. It had become a bottleneck, a point where the desperate geometry of encirclement forced everything through a single, narrow opening in the forest. The roads leading west through the woodland had already been largely abandoned by the Germans, who understood with grim clarity that any column moving openly along packed earth would be slaughtered by Soviet artillery. So instead, they moved through the trees themselves, on forest tracks that had carried nothing heavier than a cart since before anyone there had been born. The Soviets, however, had anticipated exactly this movement. They had placed their blocking positions not on the roads themselves, but at the points where those forest paths inevitably converged, where the woods opened into clearings, where geography itself demanded that the fleeing men bunch together. The sound that first announced the Soviet positions to the German columns was not the sudden roar of direct fire, but something quieter and more ominous, the steady, methodical thump of mortar tubes dropping shells into their tubes, that hollow metallic percussion that carries through forest in a way that makes the trees themselves seem to tremble. The artillery began in the late afternoon, when the light was beginning to soften, but still strong enough to cast long shadows across the clearings. The Ninth Army soldiers describe in their post-war testimonies a peculiar kind of waiting that preceded each barrage, a moment of suspension, a holding of breath, as if the forest itself were listening for something distant that was racing toward them through the air. When the shells arrived, they did not arrive alone. They came in clusters, in waves, the forest erupting into a chaos of sound that made coherent thought almost impossible for the men caught beneath it. Splinters of pine bark mixed with smoke. The ground jumped beneath their feet. And yet, because the Soviets could not see clearly into the dense woodland, Much of the fire passed overhead or landed just wide of the columns, which meant that the men who survived the first moments were faced with an impossible choice: continue forward through fire they could not fully see, or attempt to find cover in a landscape that offered none. The trees themselves became both shelter and trap. A pine trunk 3 feet wide would stop a bullet, but would not stop a mortar fragment. The underbrush offered concealment, but also confusion. Men could become separated from their units in a matter of seconds, lost in a forest that suddenly felt as hostile as any enemy. The engagement at Halbe was not, strictly speaking, a battle in the traditional sense. No armies maneuvered, no grand strategic movements unfolded. Instead, what occurred was more like a collision, a grinding attrition at close quarters, where the advantage belonged entirely to the defenders. The Soviets did not need to advance. They simply needed to hold their positions and pour fire into the German columns as they attempted to break through. The Germans, exhausted and low on ammunition, were forced to advance or die trying. There was, however, a peculiar and terrible rhythm to the engagement. The German columns would begin moving again after a lull in the Soviet fire, officers blowing whistles that somehow carried through the noise and confusion, voices calling out orders that many men could barely hear. They would move perhaps 50 yards, perhaps 100, before the fire would intensify again, forcing them to drop and take what cover they could find among the twisted roots and the scattered rocks. Then another pause, another push forward, another wall of fire. It was less like an hour of battle than like several hours compressed into a single terrible afternoon, though the men who survived it would spend the rest of their lives unable to accurately remember whether it lasted 2 hours or 5. What the records and the testimonies agree upon is the sound of it. The artillery, yes, but also the rattle of small arms fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Soviet infantrymen and tank crews shooting down from positions on the higher ground that ringed the clearing, the officers blowing their whistles, the anguished voices of wounded men, the commands being shouted and repeated and distorted by the noise and the echoes from the trees. Beneath all of this, something that many men mentioned but few could adequately describe, the sound of the forest itself, the way the explosions seemed to shake the entire woodland, as if the trees were groaning under the assault. One account, recorded decades after the war by a man who had been a young Wehrmacht soldier in the clearing at Halbe that day, describes it as a kind of drowning. He had never seen the ocean, he explained to his interviewer, but he imagined that drowning in the sea was something like what happened there in the woods, a sensation of being utterly surrounded by something that pressed in from all sides, of being unable to breathe properly, of a desperate thrashing about in a medium that was both vast and completely imprisoning. The specific details of his experience, the exact position of the firing, the precise number of men near him, had long since faded into vagueness. What remained was the quality of the sensation itself, the feeling of being crushed between two forces. Perhaps another way to understand what occurred at Halbe is to recognize that the fighting there was not primarily a matter of heroic assaults or clever tactical maneuvers. The Soviet defenders knew they simply had to persist. The German soldiers knew they had to advance or perish. There were no elaborate feints, no coordinated flanking movements. The engagement was almost mechanical in its nature. Soviet artillery and machine guns firing into a narrowing corridor of woodland. German soldiers pressing forward because no other option remained to them. Officers trying to maintain order in a situation where order had become almost meaningless. The clearing itself, the place where the worst of the fighting occurred, was perhaps 200 yards across at its widest point. It had been a logging clearing at some point in the past, the trees cut back to allow wagons to move through. Now it became a killing ground. The Germans had to cross it. The Soviets had turned it into a funnel, a place where the density of fire was so great that the statistics of survival became almost mathematical. A man crossed if he was lucky, if he moved quickly enough, if the shells happened to fall just to the left or just to the right of where he was running. Many men did cross, many men did not. The human mind has certain limits on what it can fully process. in terms of horror or chaos. The testimonies of those who were there suggest that even as it was happening, many men experienced a kind of fragmentation of consciousness, as if their awareness was being divided among multiple competing sensations. The immediate threat of the fire, yes, but also hunger, which had been a constant companion for weeks, cold, despite the spring weather, exhaustion so profound that it seemed almost dreamlike. For some men, that dreamlike quality was merciful. It meant that the worst moments did not register with their full weight until long after they were safely away from Halbe, if they ever became safe at all. What the records clearly show is this. By the time the German columns had pressed through the clearing and begun moving westward again, they had left behind hundreds of men, some dead, some wounded, some so disoriented by the experience that they became separated from their units and were picked up later by Soviet patrols. The Ninth Army, as an organized fighting force, continued to exist after the engagement at Halbe, but something had been broken in it that day. The momentum, already fragile, had been damaged further. The belief, however tenuous it had been, that escape to the west was possible, had been shaken. And so the column moved on, deeper into the forest, the sound of the mortars gradually fading behind them as they put distance between themselves and the clearing. But it was not a fade into silence. Ahead of them, in directions they could not yet see, the Soviet positions were already shifting, reorganizing, preparing for the next German wave that would inevitably emerge from the trees, seeking to break through to the west. From the Soviet perspective, the encirclement that was tightening around the Ninth Army in those final weeks of April represented something almost textbook in its execution, yet also something profoundly difficult to control once the forest itself became the battlefield. Marshal Zhukov and his subordinate commanders had learned through years of grinding war on the Eastern Front exactly how to apply overwhelming force in ways that would break an army apart from within, and the Halbe Pocket became the stage for that accumulated knowledge, deployed with methodical, almost mechanical precision. The Soviet artillery, which had become the true ruler of Eastern European battlefields by 1945, was positioned in arcs around the encircled German forces. Think of it not as neat concentric circles, but as overlapping zones of coverage, with guns sighted on the higher ground wherever the terrain allowed it, near the village of Neuendorf to the north, along the approaches from the east, anchored by the captured settlements that Soviet forces had already subdued in their relentless advance. These were not small support guns, but the heavy stuff, 152mm gun howitzers, the 122mm M1931 pieces that had become the workhorse of Soviet firepower, and the notorious Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, whose distinctive sound, that rippling whoosh like tearing canvas, had come to symbolize Soviet destructive power across half a continent. The gunners themselves were exhausted men, operating under officers who demanded results, rationed ammunition strictly, but deployed it with devastating concentration whenever German movement was detected or whenever headquarters decided that a particular sector needed to be softened. The rhythm of this bombardment was what many survivors would remember decades later with a kind of hollow precision. It was not constant. Ammunition, even for the Soviets with their vast industrial capacity, had its limits, and decisions about where to concentrate fire had to be made continuously. But it was relentless in its pattern. Dawn would often bring a systematic pounding of known concentrations of German troops, areas where intelligence or observation had suggested men and vehicles were gathering. Then, as the day progressed, the fire would shift, following reports from forward observers, directed by small aircraft that dared to venture into the zone, despite German anti-aircraft efforts. The psychological weight of this artillery bombardment cannot be overstated. A man huddled in a forest dugout, listening to shells howling overhead and the concussive blast of impacts sometimes only dozens of meters away, begins to lose his sense of time, begins to wonder if the barrage will ever stop, begins to understand in a way that no peacetime mind can quite grasp what it means to be trapped and pounded methodically by an enemy that has infinite supplies and infinite patience. But the artillery was only one dimension of the Soviet tactics. Perhaps equally important, and certainly more visible to those caught within the pocket, were the blocking positions that Soviet forces established along the likely routes of German breakout. Here, the forest itself became both asset and liability. Dense woodland is difficult to traverse with vehicles, which made the forest tracks and the few roads that cut through the Spreewald relatively easy to garrison and defend. Soviet commanders, understanding this completely, positioned their blocking forces not in linear defenses, but in depth, creating what amounted to fortified nodes along the main corridors of movement. Small clusters of infantry, supported by anti-tank guns, their positions mutually supporting where possible, their task simply to hold and to deny passage. These were not elaborate entrenchments, but something more flexible. A company here, a strengthened platoon there, communications between them maintained by runners, and the occasional working radio. When German columns attempted to push through, they would run into the first blocking position, try to outflank it by moving into the dense woods, and then run into a second position, set slightly deeper. This grinding attrition, this series of small collisions along multiple forest corridors, was perhaps more terrible in some ways than a single catastrophic battle would have been. There was no moment of clear defeat, no point at which surrender could be cleanly offered and accepted. Instead, there were hours and hours of confused fighting in the half-darkness of the forest, where visibility extended only 50 or 100 meters at most, where the sound of automatic fire seemed to come from all directions, where a man could fire his rifle at shadows and muzzle flashes and never know if he had hit anything at all. Small groups of Germans, companies and platoons that had become separated from their parent units would encounter Soviet blocking positions by accident, attempt to break through, lose men in the attempt, and then scatter into the woods, some eventually finding other German groups, others simply trying to survive long enough to reach the Elbe. The Soviet forces, for their part, were under standing orders to stop the German breakout, but they were also operating under conditions of considerable uncertainty. The forest limited visibility and communication just as much for them as for their German opponents. They could not be everywhere at once, and the German Ninth Army, despite its weakness, still possessed something that the Soviets respected: desperation and the willingness to take extraordinary risks. So what emerged was not a set-piece battle, but rather a diffuse, grinding conflict spread across dozens of square kilometers of woodland, a conflict that continued night and day, that consumed men and ammunition on both sides, that produced no dramatic conclusion, but rather a slow leaching away of German capability. The question that emerges, when one sits quietly with the historical record of those weeks, is whether the Soviet commanders were trying to annihilate the Ninth Army completely, or whether they were content to simply break it apart and drive its remnants westward, away from Berlin and toward the American lines. The evidence suggests something of both simultaneously. Zhukov's primary objective was to destroy the German military capacity and to secure the approaches to Berlin itself, which meant that allowing a large German army to remain cohesive in the pocket was unacceptable. But the Soviets also seemed to have understood, perhaps intuitively, that German soldiers who were already exhausted and desperate, German soldiers who could see that the war was lost, were more likely to surrender to Western forces than to resist to the last man. So the blocking positions and the artillery concentrations served a dual purpose. They prevented the Ninth Army from mounting any organized counterattack toward Berlin, and they channeled German escape attempts in specific directions, toward the west and the Elbe, where American forces were waiting. The forest corridors, those dark green tunnels where German columns attempted their breakouts, became in a sense a testing ground for Soviet tactics that had been refined over 4 years of brutal warfare. There was nothing innovative about what the Soviets did. They had done similar things in Operation Kutsk, in the crossing of the Dnieper, in the liberation of Ukraine, but there was a kind of perfected competence to it, a sense that Soviet commanders had learned how to apply overwhelming force with surgical precision, even in terrain as difficult as dense woodland. The men who died in those forest corridors, German and Soviet alike, died not in a moment of terrible confusion, but rather as part of a grinding process, predictable in its general shape, even if the specific details of each small action remained chaotic and unknowable to those involved. The forests of the Spreewald, in late April, were dense beyond what any map could properly convey. Beech and pine stood so thickly that sunlight fell in scattered coins through the canopy, and a man walking between the trees might lose sight of his own platoon within 50 meters. This density, which had seemed almost peaceful in peacetime, became something altogether different once the encirclement tightened. The woodland became a labyrinth. It became a trap. It became, in a very real way, the battlefield itself. Think for a moment about what close fighting in such terrain actually means. In open country, armies arrange themselves in lines, in formations that echo back centuries of tactical doctrine. But in dense forest, such geometry collapses entirely. A regiment becomes a collection of scattered companies. Companies fragment into squads moving between trees, each small group acting almost independently, guided more by compass bearings and instinct than by orders that may never arrive. The forest swallows sound in ways that seem almost deliberate. Gunfire echoes but does not carry far. A man shouting for his sergeant 5 trees away might not be heard. A colonel's commands transmitted by radio become abstractions, sometimes contradicted by what the men can actually see and feel around them. The fighting inside the Spreewald Pocket took on this intimate, fragmented quality almost immediately. Soviet and German forces were not arrayed in defensive lines, but rather collided in the forest, in smaller, more chaotic engagements. A German column moving westward through the trees might encounter a Soviet blocking position suddenly, with no warning save the crack of rifles and the metallic whisper of machine gun fire through branches. The response came not from a coordinated divisional counterattack, but from whatever infantry was closest, moving between the trees like hunters stalking through undergrowth. This kind of combat is bewildering, in ways that formal military history sometimes struggles to capture. Vision narrows. The horizon disappears behind trunks and tangled undergrowth. Men fire at muzzle flashes they glimpse through branches, at shadows that might be enemies or might be nothing at all. In the thickness of the woods, the difference between 300 meters and 30 meters becomes almost meaningless. A sniper positioned 20 meters into the tree line could dominate a clearing, yet the man trying to locate him might search for hours through identical-seeming forest and find no trace. The forest also shaped the psychological experience in profound ways. Soldiers fighting in open terrain maintain some awareness of the larger battle unfolding around them. They see the positions of their own forces, understand where their flanks are, know roughly where the enemy line lies. But in the Spreewald, such knowledge became impossible. A German rifleman in the trees knew only his immediate surroundings, and perhaps the direction he had been ordered to move. He might have no idea whether his regiment was holding its position, retreating, or being encircled. He might not know that the capital itself was falling while he moved through the forest. This ignorance, one suspects, was sometimes a mercy. The darkness beneath the canopy also affected how fighting unfolded. Even in daylight, the forest floor lay in perpetual shadow. As evening approached, visibility collapsed to just a few meters. Night fighting became almost incomprehensible in its disorientation. Men moving through the forest at night navigated by feel and memory of the ground they had crossed hours earlier. They called out passwords in whispers, always uncertain whether the next figure emerging from the darkness was friend or enemy. Several accounts mention that German and Soviet soldiers sometimes fired on one another at ranges of just a few meters, so sudden and disorienting were the encounters. The forest floor itself presented its own challenges. The Spreewald sits on sandy soil, with patches of bog and water that vary by season. In April, after the spring melt, the ground in low-lying areas had become soft and wet. A man could move silently through such terrain, but his feet would sink slightly, and exhausted men, and they were all exhausted by this point, had to be careful not to stumble and fall. Where streams ran through the forest, they had become barriers. A column trying to move westward had to locate crossing points, and these became natural places for Soviet forces to establish blocking positions. What strikes one, reading the accounts of soldiers who fought in those woods, is how much of the experience was sensory rather than strategic. Men remember the smell of the forest after rain, the sound of branches breaking underfoot, the way their eyes never quite adjusted to the dimness. They remember the noise of artillery beginning in the distance and then gradually drawing closer, a slow tightening of the noose that you could hear in the forest even before you could see any evidence of the Soviet advance. They remember the taste of water from forest streams and how desperately thirsty they always seemed to be. The forest also permitted a kind of concealment that became essential to survival. While open country offered no shelter from artillery or aircraft, the trees provided at least the possibility of cover. A German unit that came under fire could scatter into the undergrowth and disappear. This meant that Soviet forces attempting to pursue or encircle had difficulty pinning their quarry in place. But it also meant that the front lines were never truly fixed. The fighting had a fluid, almost phantom quality. You might hold a stretch of forest at dawn, only to discover by noon that Soviet forces had moved around your position through the trees, cutting off your retreat. One wonders what it must have been like to realize, slowly and with growing certainty, that you were surrounded. Perhaps it came gradually, through conflicting reports and radio traffic that grew more desperate. Perhaps it came suddenly, when a Soviet patrol emerged from the trees ahead, and there was nowhere left to go. But there is something uniquely disorienting about being surrounded in forest. You cannot see the surrounding forces. You cannot clearly understand where the closest friendly position lies. The only certainty is the proximity of enemies and the thickness of the wood in every direction. The forest, in its patient indifference, witnessed all of this. The trees had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. They sheltered both the hunter and the hunted, the fleeing and the pursuing. They muffled screams and gunshot alike, absorbing them into the ordinary soundscape of wind and creaking branches. A man lying wounded beneath a spruce tree could call out for help and hear only silence return to him, the forest absorbing his voice. The survivors who walked out of those woods carried with them the memory of the forest as a kind of presence, not hostile exactly, but utterly indifferent to human suffering, concerned only with its own slow cycle of seasons and growth. That indifference, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing of all. By the last days of April, the officers inside the Halbe Pocket faced a choice that was no choice at all. They could remain where they were, pressed into the forests, running out of ammunition and food, while the Soviets tightened their grip like fingers closing around sand. Or they could attempt what some would later call a breakout, and others, more honestly, a desperate bid for survival before the pocket collapsed entirely into chaos. The decision, as these things often are in war, was made by necessity rather than hope. The roads leading westward from Halbe toward Baruth had become arteries of movement by late April. Picture, if you will, the sandy forest tracks that wound through the Spreewald, tracks that had carried farmers' carts and local traffic for centuries, now suddenly filled with a movement of men and vehicles unlike anything the region had ever witnessed. Columns of Wehrmacht trucks, some painted with branch camouflage that had faded to a tired green, mixed with captured Soviet vehicles, repainted hastily with German markings. Self-propelled guns, their crews young and exhausted, rumbled over roots and stones. Horse-drawn artillery, pulled by creatures nearly as starving as the men who led them. And everywhere, walking, sometimes at a pace that was almost a shuffle, were the soldiers themselves. Thousands of them, or perhaps tens of thousands. The accounts vary, and memory compresses such numbers in ways we can never fully trust. General Theodor Busse, the commander of 9th Army, understood that to remain static was to die slowly. Better, he reasoned, to attempt a concentrated push westward, to crash through the Soviet lines while there was still fuel in the tanks, and enough coordination among the scattered units to form something resembling a coordinated force. The Soviet ring around the pocket was not uniform, you see. It was thin in places, where units stretched across impossible frontages, where exhaustion and the fog of rapid maneuver had created moments of vulnerability. These were the moments Busse and his officers meant to exploit. The Autobahn, that monumental artifact of Nazi engineering that stretched between Berlin and the Ruhr, represented something both powerful and terrible in the collective mind of the trapped army. To reach the Autobahn meant reaching a major artery, meant the possibility of rapid movement westward toward the Elbe and American lines. But the Autobahn was also Soviet-held territory. Soviet reconnaissance had spotted the highway weeks earlier. Soviet anti-tank guns and infantry had been positioned along it, expecting exactly what now began to unfold. The irony was profound but lost in the immediate calculus of survival. The first serious breakout attempt began somewhere around April 24th, though the exact chronology of these days has a peculiar fluidity in the historical record. Different units attacked at different times. Some sources speak of coordinated waves. Others suggest the movement was more chaotic, more a general pressing westward that took on the appearance of waves only when described afterward. What seems clear is that the Germans attempted not one breakthrough but several, each one testing the Soviet positions in a different location along the encirclement's perimeter, each one meant to pull Soviet reserves away from the place where Busse hoped to drive the main force through. The sound of such a breakout would have been extraordinary. Imagine, first, the rumble of engines, so many engines working simultaneously that the forest itself seemed to vibrate. Then the artillery, Soviet guns responding to the movement, the sharp crack of impacts, the whoosh and thud of shells striking earth and wood and metal and flesh. There would have been shouting, radio chatter thick with interference and urgency, officers trying to maintain some semblance of order in something that was rapidly becoming disorder. The smell, one suspects, was overwhelming. Diesel fuel, burnt powder, dust from the forest floor kicked up by tires and boots, the unmistakable copper scent of blood mixed with the green smell of crushed pine and earth. The vehicles presented the greatest vulnerability and also the greatest prize. A truck full of soldiers moving through forest at night, trying to maintain silence while maintaining speed. These were nearly impossible targets to hit cleanly, but when they were hit, the consequences were absolute. A shell through the cabin, a mine detonating beneath the wheel wells. Suddenly 30 men who had survived weeks of grinding attrition were simply gone, their story ending not in a final battle, but in a moment of fire and fragmentation they never saw coming. The first wave that pushed toward Baruth, according to most accounts, achieved some penetration. Soviet positions were, in fact, broken in places. Small breakthroughs, areas where German infantry managed to overwhelm isolated Soviet defensive posts, where the momentum of bodies and desperation overcame firepower and preparation. But these successes were local and temporary. As soon as the breakout began to concentrate at specific points, Soviet commanders moved reserves to reinforce those points. Counterattacks were launched. The narrow corridors through which the Germans were attempting to push became killing zones, compressed spaces where superior Soviet artillery could be concentrated with devastating effect. How many men died in these attempts to reach the Autobahn? The question itself is complicated by the fact that survivors often reported their own breakouts, while those who fell in the forest sometimes had no one to report them at all. Soviet records speak of inflicting tens of thousands of casualties. German survivors' accounts speak of horror and darkness, and the sound of men screaming in the woods. Some sources suggest that in the battle for the approaches to Baruth itself, thousands fell in a single night of fighting. Others are more cautious, noting only that the losses were significant, and that momentum, once lost, was never fully regained. There is something worth considering, quietly, in the middle of the night, when such thoughts naturally arise. These men breaking out of the pocket were not, for the most part, fanatics. Some were, certainly. The SS units among them often maintained discipline and a kind of ideological commitment to fighting until the absolute end. But many were ordinary men, drafted or conscripted years earlier, men who had already survived longer than they had any right to expect, men who were now at the end of their strength and their hope. The breakout was not an act of courage born from commitment, but an act of survival born from the simple desire not to be captured or killed, which amounts to something very human and very sad. By April 25th or 26th, some German units were reporting that they had actually reached the Autobahn. Radio messages suggested a major breakthrough, the possibility that the entire pocket might pour through the gap and escape toward the west. There was a moment, perhaps, when officers allowed themselves to believe that something approaching success was possible. But these moments of hope, in the late stages of a collapsing military force, are often the cruelest gifts, because they are so frequently followed by a renewal of catastrophe. The Soviet response to each breakout attempt became more sophisticated and more crushing. Artillery would be concentrated ahead of the advancing Germans, turning forest clearings into zones of impact and shock. Blocking positions would be established just behind breakthrough points to catch the German columns in the act of advancing. Tank counterattacks would strike at the flanks of German formations that had committed themselves too fully to forward movement. The Soviets, after months of offensive operations, had become skilled at this kind of mobile warfare, at using terrain and firepower to trap and destroy army-sized formations. The Halbe Pocket was, in many respects, a laboratory where Soviet operational art was reaching its full maturity. What began to emerge in these late April days was a kind of grinding attrition that became worse, in some ways, than the holding pattern of the earlier encirclement. At least when the pocket was stationary, men could preserve energy, could ration supplies, could maintain some psychological stability in the knowledge that eventually something would happen. But now, with each failed breakthrough attempt, with each night of crawling through the dark forest trying to find a route westward, with each dawn that brought artillery fire raining down before the exhausted men could even organize themselves for the day ahead, something was breaking in the collective will of the trapped army. Hunger deepened. Ammunition ran lower with each engagement. Medical supplies, already meager, were rapidly consumed by the mounting stream of wounded. The horses pulling the artillery, never well fed at the best of times, were now being eaten by the men who drove them, a dark arithmetic of survival that meant abandoning the few remaining guns and vehicles when there was no longer anything to pull them. Imagine the sound of such decisions being made, officers ordering the destruction of trucks and guns that had taken months to manufacture, weapons that represented the last vestiges of organized military power, all of it being set on fire or blown apart, because it could no longer be moved and could not be left for the enemy. The younger men, the Hitler Youth conscripts who had been incorporated into the pocket in the final weeks, suffered particularly badly. They had no reserves of experience to draw upon, no memory of surviving other campaigns, other withdrawals, other moments when the world seemed to be ending. For many of them, this forest encirclement was simply the end, and the breakout attempts merely different ways to reach that end. The older men, the Volkssturm members in their 50s and 60s, who had somehow found themselves fighting in organized military units again, shared a different species of despair. They had thought the wars of their youth were over. They had believed their children would not experience what they had experienced. And now, in the spring of 1945, they were living through a kind of terrible encore. The roads themselves became monuments to the desperation of these days. German soldiers in the decades after the war would speak of roads thick with abandoned weapons, roads lined with the bodies of those who had fallen or lain down and never risen again. The corpses would be hastily buried in mass graves beside the forest tracks, or left where they fell, because there was no longer time or enough living men available to perform the work of the dead. And always, there was the sound of Soviet artillery in the distance, or sometimes not in the distance, the terrible proximity of shells that meant the Soviets had moved another blocking position ahead, had anticipated where the next breakout attempt would be directed. By the last week of April, the narrative of the Halbe Pocket had transformed from the story of an encircled army attempting to hold a perimeter into the story of a fragmenting force attempting to force its way out by any means available. Some units succeeded in breaking through and reaching the autobahn. Others found themselves turned aside by Soviet positions and forced to find other routes westward through the forest. And still others became so scattered in the darkness and confusion that they lost all semblance of unit cohesion and became merely groups of armed men trying to move westward, hoping that sooner or later they would encounter either their own relieving forces or the Americans, not fully certain which outcome they feared more. What survives of those days now lives only in memory, and memory, as we know, is a thing made of both light and shadow. In the decades after the war, soldiers who had walked those forest tracks began to write letters, give interviews, and sit with historians in quiet rooms, trying to reconstruct what their bodies had lived through. Their minds had perhaps been merciful enough to partially forget. These testimonies form a kind of archive of survival, fragmented and deeply personal, and they offer us a window into the human experience inside the pocket that no official military document could ever quite capture. One former Wehrmacht NCO, whose name and unit have been preserved in a collection held in a Berlin archive, recalled the afternoon when the realization of encirclement became unavoidable. He described how the radio operators in his company headquarters had stopped receiving clear orders from higher command, how the frequencies had filled instead with confusion, with competing voices, with increasingly frantic requests for ammunition and medical supplies that would never arrive. What struck him most, he said many years later in his testimony, was not the sound of the distant artillery or even the sight of smoke rising above the trees, but the peculiar silence that followed each wave of bombardment. That absolute quiet, he remembered, felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Now, we should be careful here, as we always must be with memory. The human mind, especially when processing trauma, has a way of organizing chaos into narratives that make emotional sense rather than strict factual sense. The silence he described so poignantly may have been, in reality, a relative absence of noise compared to the bombardment itself, or it may have been embellished in the telling and retelling across 50 years. Yet the emotional truth he was reaching for, that moment of realization, that peculiar psychological transition from confusion to certain doom that carries its own kind of weight. Another soldier, this one from a makeshift unit of Hitler Youth and older Volkssturm men who had been thrown together only days before the pocket closed, spoke of a night spent in a birch grove waiting for an order to move. He was perhaps 17, and the oldest man in his group was a retired postal clerk from Berlin in his 60s. In the darkness, they could hear the sound of tracked vehicles moving somewhere beyond their line of sight, though whether those vehicles were German or Soviet, no one could say with certainty. The uncertainty itself, he recalled, was a kind of torment. They had been told to hold position, but not told when or if they would be moved. They had been told that relief was coming, but not told from where or when. He described sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers in the cold, damp undergrowth, listening to a wounded man a few meters away, making soft sounds of pain, sounds that the wounded man seemed almost embarrassed to make, as if apologizing for his own suffering. Hours passed, or was it minutes? In his post-war account, given when he was in his 70s, he admitted uncertainty about the actual duration. Time had compressed and stretched in those moments, in ways he could never quite reconstruct. Yet he remembered with absolute clarity the sound of the old postal clerk beside him, praying quietly, methodically, in a voice too low for anyone else to really hear, and how that sound had made the darkness feel slightly less complete. A Soviet artillery officer, whose memoirs were translated and have since been archived, described what the encirclement looked like from the other side. His battery had been positioned on a slight rise outside the pocket, and he could see, through his field glasses, lines of German soldiers moving through the forest, sometimes running, sometimes crawling. He recalled giving the order to fire and watching through the glasses as the forest erupted. He was matter-of-fact about it in his account. This was his duty, this was what warfare entailed. Yet even in the translated text, there is a kind of subdued weariness in his description. He noted that after each bombardment, more figures would appear, moving in different directions now, confused, trying to find routes around the fire. He estimated, though he was honest that this was an estimate, that his battery alone might have accounted for somewhere between 200 and 300 casualties over the course of the Pocket's 3-week collapse. He could not be certain. The smoke was thick. The confusion was absolute. How does one count the dead when they fall in forest darkness? These testimonies, pulled from archives and oral history projects conducted across Germany and Russia in the 1960s and 1970s, paint a picture that is simultaneously precise in its small details and bewilderingly vague in its larger shape. A man can remember with photographic clarity the color of a particular tree or the exact taste of black bread soaked in melted snow water, and yet be absolutely unable to remember whether a particular episode took place over 2 days or 5. A woman who was a refugee in the region could describe in perfect detail the uniforms of the soldiers who came through her farmyard, yet be uncertain whether those soldiers were fleeing eastward or westward, whether they were Soviet pursuers or German fugitives. There is a man named Karl, whose account appears in several post-war collections, who spent 3 days inside the Halbe Pocket before managing to slip away eastward towards Soviet lines, rather than attempting the Western breakthrough. His reasoning was simple. He was exhausted. His unit had dissolved into chaos, and he believed that surrendering to the Soviets, though it would certainly mean years of imprisonment or labor, was preferable to almost certain death trying to break through prepared positions. In his testimony, given in 1968, he described the moment of decision with unusual clarity. He was standing in a clearing as dawn broke. The trees around him were stippled with thin snow, and the smell of burned materials, wood, canvas, diesel fuel, things he could not quite identify, hung in the air. He heard gunfire in multiple directions, and he realized in that moment that there was no good choice, only different varieties of bad ones. He chose the one that seemed most likely to result in his body remaining more or less intact, even if the rest of his life would be constrained by captivity. He walked toward the sound of voices speaking Russian, and when Soviet soldiers appeared through the trees, he raised his hands. He expected to be shot. He was not shot. He lived, though the next 5 years of his life, spent in a Soviet labor camp outside Magnitogorsk, were by his own account profoundly difficult. But Karl's story is also, we must acknowledge, a survivor's story, and survivor stories carry a particular kind of bias. They exist because this particular man lived. Hundreds of thousands of other men and women inside or adjacent to the Halbe Pocket did not survive to give testimonies. Their absence from our archive, their silence, is itself a kind of evidence, though evidence of what, precisely, we can never fully know. The post-war collections are therefore incomplete records of incomplete experiences, memories preserved at a distance of decades or more from the events they describe, edited and shaped by the intervening years, by trauma, by the human need to make meaning from chaos. And yet these fragmented, imperfect testimonies are all we have. They are the voices of the pocket, thin and distorted by time though they may be. A mother in Brandenburg described how German soldiers had passed through her town and taken her remaining stores of food and firewood, and then, hours later, another group of German soldiers, different men entirely, had come to her door and asked for the same things, not knowing that the supplies had already been requisitioned. She had nothing to give them. She remembered one of them, a very young man with a facial scar, sitting on her stoop and weeping without sound, the tears simply running down his face, while his shoulders remained perfectly still. She did not know what happened to him. She never saw him again. She never knew his name. These are the textures of survival and loss. Not grand historical narratives, but small, vivid moments preserved in the amber of aging memory. They are fragmentary, contradictory sometimes, impossible to verify with perfect certainty, yet they carry truths about exhaustion, about fear, about the peculiar intimacy of shared suffering, truths that no official history could convey alone. The forest that witnessed these events remembers nothing. We remember for it, imperfectly, through the words and recollections of those who walked beneath its canopy in those final days of April 1945, people who lived long enough to speak of what they had endured, and in speaking, preserved something of the ordinary human experience within the grinding machinery of war's collapse. In the final days of April, as the forest corridors filled with exhausted men and the Soviet artillery never quite stopped its distant drumming, something unexpected began to happen. Reports came through the crackling radio nets, fragmentary at first, then with increasing urgency. Walther Wenck's 12th Army, that phantom force that had existed more in Hitler's imagination than on any coherent battlefield, was actually moving. It was moving northward, toward the Spreewald, toward the place where 9th Army's survivors were slowly fighting their way westward through the trees. The convergence, when it began to unfold, carried with it a strange quality of hope mixed with the peculiar sorrow of rescue, arriving just as the worst of the danger was passing. Some units of Wenck's 12th Army, drawn from the much-depleted reserves around the Elbe, had begun their own advance toward Belitz, a town that lay between the Soviet encirclement and the promised American lines. It was never a large movement, never a coordinated relief in the classical sense that the German High Command had fantasized about in their final bunker meetings. Rather, it was a series of local pushes, small tactical victories that opened corridors and allowed passages where before there had been none. Near Belitz itself, in the rolling country south and west of Berlin, where the pine forest gradually gave way to more open agricultural land, elements of 9th Army and scattered formations of 12th Army made contact. The moment itself was deeply human in its contradictions. There was genuine relief, even tears, among some of the men who had spent days believing that Soviet encirclement meant death or captivity with no other possibility. The appearance of new troops, of vehicles moving in their direction rather than against them, of officers with authority intact and maps that showed routes to the west. These things were real, and they meant survival for many who might otherwise have perished in the woods. Yet this rescue, such as it was, arrived with an undertone of futility that only the historical perspective can fully illuminate. Thousands of men from 9th Army had already died in the breakout attempts before any contact with 12th Army forces came about. The encirclement had been so swift, the Soviet forces so overwhelming, that the men who had perished in the first desperate pushes through the forest corridors did not live to feel the relief of American protection. They fell to artillery, to small arms fire, to the grinding attrition of close-quarters fighting in dense woodland, and they never knew that help was, in some measure, coming. The soldiers themselves, in those first encounters between the armies, spoke to one another with a peculiar exhaustion that transcended ordinary military discipline. Wenck's men, drawn largely from the remnants of German forces that had been badly mauled in the fighting around the Elbe, were themselves depleted, lacking supplies, operating on orders that were contradictory at best and phantasmagorical at worst. They were attempting to create a relief corridor with forces that could barely maintain their own cohesion. The convergence, from a strictly military standpoint, was less a breakthrough than a mutual recognition between two groups of men who understood that the war was ending and that staying alive in its final days required less heroism than it required luck and proximity to American forces. The journey of those who managed to link up with 12th Army and find their way toward the Elbe was itself a difficult passage. The roads and forest tracks in the Belitz area remained contested, occasionally swept by Soviet artillery fire, and the Soviet command was far from finished with the remnants of 9th Army. As these mixed columns of surviving 9th Army men and their 12th Army guides moved westward, they did so in columns that could not move quickly, could not afford to scatter, and could not be certain that the next curve in the road, or clearing in the forest, would not bring a fresh Soviet attack. There was something almost dreamlike about the experience, according to accounts left by survivors. After days of fighting in complete encirclement, with all radio contact to higher headquarters lost or reduced to desperate fragments of communication, the appearance of organized German units with coherent objectives and actual direction to travel seemed almost unreal. Some men questioned whether it was a mirage of exhaustion. Others, who had already seen so much that seemed impossible in those final weeks of the war, simply accepted it as the latest turn in a series of turns that had ceased to make rational sense. The civilians in the Belitz area, those who had not already fled westward in the early weeks of the spring, watched this convergence with their own complicated feelings. Here were German soldiers moving away from the Soviet advance, yes, but also German soldiers moving toward a future that was still deeply uncertain. The Americans were genuinely east of here, but how close? Weeks away? Days? Would the Soviets stop before the Elbe or push further? These questions hung over the landscape like the smoke that still rose from distant villages. By the last days of April, the movement toward Belitz and beyond had taken on the character of a vast, slow evacuation rather than any kind of military operation in the traditional sense. Men moved on foot and in vehicles, riding on tanks, clinging to whatever offered forward momentum. The supplies that 12th Army had been promised by higher command never truly materialized, which meant that the road westward was lined with improvised solutions and the kind of exhaustion that saps even the strongest will. What made the convergence genuinely bittersweet, beyond the simple fact that it arrived too late for so many, was that it proved something that no one in the German command structure truly wanted to believe. It proved that Walter Wenck's relief attempt, which Hitler had spoken of with increasing desperation in the final bunker conferences, was never going to be the triumphant breakthrough that might change the course of the war. It was, at best, a partial rescue of those already on their way to survival. The men who made it through to Belitz and beyond, who eventually reached the American lines and the possibility of surrender as prisoners of war rather than Soviet captives, were those who had already survived the worst of the encirclement. The rescue, in effect, was saving those who had already, in some measure, saved themselves. And so the convergence, in the quiet way that military history often records such moments, was both triumph and anticlimax. It was real enough for those who experienced it, a genuine turn toward the possibility of survival, but it was late enough to cast its own shadow, a reminder that there are moments in human history when even rescue carries with it the weight of all those it could not reach in time. When the forest finally fell silent in early May, when the last shots echoed away into Brandenburg's spring evening and the birds began, hesitantly, to sing again, what remained was a landscape of the dead that no map could chart with precision. The exact toll of those final weeks in the Halbe Pocket has never been known with certainty, and perhaps that very uncertainty is part of how this catastrophe differs from the neatly documented horrors of industrialized camps. Here, in scattered clearings and along overgrown forest tracks, lay the accumulated weight of a collapsing army and a fractured world, and the work of accounting for them would stretch across decades, pursued by those with neither the resources nor, at first, the political permission to do it thoroughly. Soviet records claimed some figures, German survivors offered others, and the truth, as with so many things from that final spring, lay somewhere in the fog between recollection and loss. Contemporary Soviet estimates suggested 15 to 20,000 German dead in and around the pocket, though some post-war German accounts, drawing on burial records and testimony, proposed numbers rising toward 30,000 or beyond. The variation matters less than the weight of it. Imagine a small city of the dead, scattered not in one grave, but across dozens, across hundreds of unnamed places, where a man fell and was buried in haste, or not buried at all, or was moved, and moved again, as the earth itself seemed to shift beneath victors and vanquished alike. The immediate aftermath brought something that the modern mind often overlooks in its focus on the grand mathematics of mass death. It brought the simple, exhausting logistics of disposal. Soviet units, themselves depleted and tired, faced a landscape littered with human remains that could not be left to dissolution. In some places, hastily dug pits were deepened and widened. In others, ravines and bomb craters became graves. Forest workers and local civilians, pressed into service or moving numbly through shock, carried bodies to these sites day after day. There are accounts, preserved in post-war testimony, of women from nearby villages who found themselves conscripted into this grim work, of the smell that rose into the Brandenburg Spring, of how some remember the sound of earth being shoveled, and how they later could not bring themselves to speak of it. What makes the burial of Halbe's dead distinct from the more infamous mass graves of the war is its diffusion across geography and time. There was no single Halbe burial ground, no centralized site where the reckoning could begin. Instead, there were dozens. Forests hold secrets more easily than towns do. A field dug up decades later might yield remains no one alive remembered burying. Local knowledge became the only archive. The farmer who knew which corner of the woods had been disturbed in 1945, the old woman who remembered helping to carry a body to a ravine as a girl, the hunters who occasionally found bone and recognized its vintage from the threads of uniform still clinging to it. The Cold War complicated remembrance almost as much as the immediate chaos of defeat. For nearly half a century, the region lay in East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain, where Soviet authorities controlled the narrative and access to burial sites. Some graves were marked, officially, with Soviet plaques or simple monuments, though these spoke to Soviet losses, not German ones. The German dead, in many places, remained where they had been hastily interred, known to local memory, but not to official record. It is one of the war's quiet paradoxes that many of the fallen from that final Eastern fighting remained, in a sense, more truly lost than those whose names were recorded and whose families eventually received notification. After the wall fell in 1989 and Germany was reunified, a different kind of work began. Organizations like the German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, moved through Brandenburg with maps drawn from local testimony, with excavation permits and careful documentation. They did not work in haste, as 1945 had demanded. In some places near Halbe, in forests now grown over with new pines, workers began opening earth that had not been disturbed in 40, 50 years. What they found was sometimes identifiable: a nameplate, a wallet with papers, the shape of a skeleton that suggested an officer or a common soldier, and sometimes not. Remains were sent for what analysis was possible. Some were reburied in the solemn German military cemeteries that dot the region now, neat rows of simple crosses and plaques in well-maintained groves. The regional cemetery at Halbe itself, formerly established as a war memorial in the post-war years, became a quiet center of remembrance. But the larger truth is dispersed. Walk through the forests south of Berlin today, and you are walking, inevitably, over places where the ground was turned for these burials. Some are marked now with small plaques or stones, many are not. The forest remembers, in its way, by the subtle depressions in the earth, by the way certain clearings feel different in their silence. One reflection that emerges from studying this particular reckoning is how differently a defeated nation and a victorious one can approach the dead. Soviet casualties were collected, counted, and, where possible, claimed. The losses of the conqueror, after all, were written into the official history of victory. German casualties, by contrast, were initially erased, not officially recorded in the immediate post-war years, sometimes actively concealed. It was only decades later, and often through the private efforts of survivors and descendants, that the work of naming and locating became systematic. This creates a strange historical archive. The dead of Halbe are documented far more through oral history, through family letters and post-war testimony, than through contemporary records. We know them often through the voices of the living who remember them, not through the names of officers recording their burial. There exists, too, a layer of moral complexity that clings to this history. Many of those buried in the forests and mass graves near Halbe had worn the uniform of a regime that conducted its own systematic murders on an industrial scale. Some were very young, conscripted into the Hitler Youth in their final weeks and sent to die without choice or full comprehension. Others were older men, Wehrmacht regulars who had fought on multiple fronts and were exhausted, perhaps horrified by what they had seen, but unable to opt out of the machinery. Still others were SS, fanatics to the end. The forest, in its burial of them all, does not distinguish, and perhaps historical memory should not either, though it is tempting to judge. The work of burial, and the later work of archaeological and administrative reckoning, operated mostly outside questions of guilt or innocence. A body was a body. The question was simply, who are you, and can we find your family? This is how the region quietly processed its dead, not through grand ceremonies or elaborate monuments, though those came too, but through the patient, unglamorous work of exhumation and identification that continued into the 1990s and beyond. Relatives arrived from West Germany, from Austria, from America where some had emigrated, seeking graves they might visit or ashes they might claim. Some came with photographs of young men, asking if anyone had seen them in the last chaotic days of the war. Some received news after decades of uncertainty. Yes, a body matching the description had been found, and here is where it now rests. The landscape itself, over time, did what landscapes do. The forest healed. Scars in the earth filled in. New growth covered the clearings. Except that the healing was never quite complete, because the work of remembrance kept opening those old wounds, and because the communities living near these sites carried forward a form of knowledge that could not quite be let go, the knowledge that the earth they walked on held unclaimed or only recently claimed dead, that history was literally beneath their feet, and that forgetting was not quite possible, even as official silence had tried to enforce it for so many years. By the final week of April, the Halbe Pocket had begun to lose the semblance of what one might still call an organized formation. The divisions that had fought so desperately through the forest corridors in the days before were now scattered into dozens of smaller groups, each one pursuing its own path westward through the pine and birch, each commanding officer improvising because the radio networks had largely fallen silent. The Ninth Army had achieved something remarkable. They had punched through Soviet lines at enormous cost, perhaps 20 or 30,000 men, though exact numbers will never be known with certainty. But what emerged from those forests were no longer coherent units. They were streams of exhausted humanity flowing toward the Elbe. Picture, if you will, the dusty roads and forest tracks leading west from Halbe in those last days of the pocket's existence. The German forces that had been so carefully positioned just days earlier, the SS divisions, the Wehrmacht regulars, the Hitler Youth companies, the Volkssturm battalions of elderly men, had been funneled through a shrinking corridor until they had no choice but to disperse. Some units held positions near Baruth and Mittenwalde to buy time for others to escape. Some turned and fought when they encountered Soviet blocking forces. Many simply walked, moving at night when possible, sleeping in shifts during the daylight hours, always aware that discovery meant capture or death or both. The psychology of that movement must have been profound. The knowledge that you were among the last organized troops of the Wehrmacht, that Berlin itself had fallen into Soviet hands days earlier, that the only hope remaining was to reach the Americans who held the western bank of the Elbe. The Soviet forces pursuing them were equally exhausted, but no less determined. Zhukov and Konev were not in the mood to allow German soldiers to slip away cleanly toward the Americans. There were still blocking forces positioned along the main routes westward, still artillery that could be brought to bear, still cavalry and mechanized units that could harry the retreating columns. The forest worked both ways. It concealed the Germans from air attack and observation, but it also fragmented the pursuit. The Soviet commanders could not maintain the kind of coordinated encirclement that had worked so effectively in the earlier phases of the pocket's destruction. What followed was more ragged, more desperate, a series of running encounters rather than coordinated defensive positions. Consider the experience of a soldier in the midst of this chaos, perhaps a young Wehrmacht private who had survived 3 weeks in the pocket, or a man who had been conscripted into the Volkssturm just weeks before, or a Hitler Youth boy, barely 16, who had been given a rifle he had barely learned to fire. The coherence of military life had dissolved entirely. There were no supply lines, no clear orders, no sense of where the command structure even was. A soldier might spend the day with one unit, find that unit dissolved or scattered by evening, and join up with a different group of men altogether by the following morning. Rank meant something, but not much. A sergeant might lead 50 men 1 hour and 5 men the next. Officers who had been barking orders 2 weeks earlier were now simply individuals trying to survive, often dressed in whatever uniform fragments they could gather, often unrecognizable as officers at all. What emerges from the post-war testimonies, and one must read these accounts with the knowledge that memory reshapes trauma in ways we can never fully untangle, is a picture of almost dreamlike desperation. Men moved through the forest in states of semi-consciousness, driven forward by a simple imperative: reach the Elbe, reach the Americans, reach a place where you might surrender and live. The hunger was constant and almost secondary to the exhaustion. Some men fell asleep while walking and had to be roused by those around them. Some simply sat down and could not be convinced to continue. Some died quietly in the forest, from wounds that had turned septic, from simple exhaustion, from despair. The forest absorbed them without ceremony. The routes toward the Elbe were not clearly marked, naturally. There were main roads, the highways that the retreating Germans desperately wanted to avoid because they would be under Soviet observation and artillery fire, but there were also the forest tracks, the hunting paths, the roads that had connected small villages for centuries. Some groups had maps, many did not. Some had guides, locals who knew the terrain and could be convinced, through various means, to lead the columns westward. The nights were growing warmer by late April, the spring advancing even as the military situation deteriorated. The birds were singing in the early mornings, one imagines, an obscene contrast to what was happening on the ground. By late April, the Ninth Army effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Individual regiments tried to maintain formation and discipline as they moved westward, but these efforts became increasingly futile. The radio frequencies where officers might have coordinated movements had become useless. Either the equipment was destroyed, or the networks had been completely jammed by Soviet interference. What happened instead was that small groups, sometimes a few hundred men, sometimes just dozens, would move independently toward the Elbe, each one hoping to reach American lines before either being captured by the Soviets or being absorbed into some final stand defensive position where they would simply die. The landscape itself was changing as the Germans moved westward. The dense Spreewald forests gave way to more open terrain, the sandy soil of Brandenburg becoming somewhat more productive, with cultivated fields appearing between the stands of trees. This was worse in some ways. The open ground offered no concealment, but better in others, because at least there was the possibility of finding food, of requisitioning supplies from the few remaining farmsteads that had not been completely stripped already. The German countryside in late April 1945 was a land stripped almost bare. Refugees, German soldiers, displaced persons from Eastern Europe, all of them hungry and taking whatever they could find. A particularly poignant detail, drawn from multiple post-war testimonies, and therefore perhaps reliable, is the matter of what these men looked like as they approached the Elbe. They were no longer recognizable as an army. Many had discarded their uniforms entirely, hoping that civilian clothes might help them blend in or escape detection. Some wore mismatched pieces of uniform, a field grey tunic with civilian trousers, an army cap with a torn civilian jacket. Many were filthy, caked in dust and mud from the forest. They were thin, visibly malnourished after weeks without proper supply. Officers and enlisted men were now indistinguishable. Age was confusing. A 30-year-old looked 60. A 16-year-old looked ancient. They moved like refugees rather than like soldiers, even though many of them were still carrying weapons. The final push toward the Elbe came in the last days of April, and here one must be careful about dates, because the documentation becomes fragmented and uncertain. Different groups reached the river on different days, some as late as the very end of April or the early days of May, when the German surrender was already a matter of established fact, even if the fighting had not quite ceased everywhere. The Elbe itself was a natural barrier, perhaps a quarter-mile wide in places, a significant obstacle that German soldiers could not simply wade across. The Americans held the western bank. This meant that reaching the Elbe was not the end of the journey, it was the final test. Men had to find boats or rafts, or had to simply swim in water that was still cold from the mountain snows of early spring. Some soldiers had become so desperate by this point that they simply waded into the river and surrendered to the American soldiers on the opposite bank, their hands raised above the water as they moved slowly across. What the American forces encountered on the eastern bank of the Elbe in late April was a sight that many of them found difficult to process. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, yes, but not in any organized military formation. Instead, there were crowds of men, groups and individuals, many of them walking as if in a daze, many of them simply waiting passively for whatever would happen next. There was no effort to mount a final defense, no last stand. The will to fight had been ground out of them by the weeks in the pocket, by the knowledge that the war was already lost, by the simple biological imperative to survive. Some American accounts describe moments of confused encounters, a group of American soldiers, not entirely certain whether they were about to be attacked or whether the Germans in front of them were actually trying to surrender. But mostly, what happened was surrender, quiet, and almost anticlimactic. The crossing of the Elbe by these surviving remnants of the Ninth Army and the other forces trapped in the Halbe Pocket was not dramatic in the way that some historical moments are. There were no speeches, no formal surrenders to named officers, no photographs of generals shaking hands. Instead, there was the simple, exhausting process of men making their way across a river, being processed by American soldiers who were themselves tired and somewhat bewildered by the sheer numbers of people appearing from the forests to the east. Some of these men were taken prisoner, held in massive temporary camps that the Americans established to deal with the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who were surrendering as the war ended. Some of them were simply released, told to go home, though home was often a destroyed house, in a city that no longer existed in any meaningful form. What happened to the men who survived the Halbe Pocket breakout? The historical record becomes diffuse here, split into dozens of smaller stories. Some were held as prisoners of war for years, particularly those who had been members of the SS, who faced interrogation and investigation for war crimes. Many were simply released within months, allowed to return to their families if they could find them. Many had no families to return to. Their homes had been destroyed, their relatives killed or displaced. The psychological aftermath must have been profound and largely unspoken. These men had been through something extraordinary, something that had no precedent in their lives and would have no parallel in their futures. They had survived the final collapse of Nazi Germany from the inside, had witnessed the disintegration of an army that had dominated Europe for years, had experienced the fear and confusion of encirclement and pursuit, and had somehow managed to reach safety on the other side of a river. The quietness of the end is perhaps what is most striking. After weeks of artillery fire and tank battles and machine gun noise and the screams of wounded men in the forests, the actual reaching of safety was often accomplished in silence or in the muted sounds of men moving through water, of quiet conversations with American soldiers who mostly did not speak German, of the bureaucratic process of capture and processing. There was no climactic battle, no dramatic last stand, no moment where one could point and say, "Here, this is when the Halbe Pocket ended." Instead, there was a gradual dissolving, a slow leaking away of men from the east bank to the west bank of the Elbe. In the years that followed, the Halbe Pocket entered a peculiar kind of silence. Not the silence of forgetting, precisely, but something closer to the silence of exhaustion, as though the landscape itself needed time to breathe and settle before memory could take root. The survivors scattered. Some moved westward into the zones of occupation that would become West Germany. Others remained in what was now Soviet territory, their stories folded into the vast, complicated narrative of the Eastern Front that the Cold War would largely keep hidden from Western consciousness for decades. The forest grew over the scarred earth. Nature, with its patient indifference, began the long work of healing what human hands had torn apart. The local people of Brandenburg, those farmers and town dwellers who had witnessed the breakout and its aftermath, faced their own reckoning. In the immediate post-war years, there was little appetite for remembrance in any official sense. The region lay in the Soviet zone of occupation, soon to become East Germany, and the priorities of reconstruction and ideological alignment left little room for memorials to Wehrmacht soldiers or to the chaotic violence of April 1945. Memory became private. Families kept stories. Women who had hidden in cellars recalled the sounds. Children who had seen columns of soldiers streaming through the woods carried those images silently into adulthood. The Halbe Pocket, in its historical moment, was overshadowed by the fall of Berlin, by the suicide of Hitler, by the vast Soviet advance that seemed to eclipse everything else. Survivors' testimonies were collected, slowly, through the decades. Many of these accounts emerged only in the 1970s and 1980s, when historians began conducting interviews with veterans, and the oral archive of Halbe began, tentatively, to form. The cemetery at Halbe itself became a kind of focal point for whatever remembrance the region could sustain. Here, beneath simple markers and in mass graves that carry names recorded long after the events they honor, lie many of those who fell during the breakout and the encirclement. The numbers were staggering. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers died in and around the pocket during those final weeks of April, though the exact toll remains uncertain. How can one count the dead when death came in forests, in bodies left unburied for weeks in the spring mud, in the chaos of a collapse so complete that no German command could render an accurate accounting? The cemetery stands now as a place of quiet pilgrimage, not heavy with the ceremonial weight of state commemoration, but marked instead by the individual acts of remembrance that families have sustained. Wreaths are laid, names are read. The site carries a kind of sorrow that is more intimate than monumental, which perhaps speaks more truthfully to what occurred there than any grand memorial could. What is remarkable is how East Germany and then unified Germany approached the history of the Halbe Pocket with considerable care and scholarly attention, even when the broader context of the war and the Eastern Front was filtered through different ideological lenses across the decades. Historians and local archivists worked to preserve testimony, to collect documents, to map the precise routes of the breakout and the positions of Soviet units. The work was unglamorous, often underfunded, but persistent. In the 1990s and 2000s, after reunification, this archival work accelerated. Regional history societies organized conferences, documentations were published. Survivors who were still living were sought out, their voices recorded, their recollections transcribed and cross-referenced. The Halbe Pocket moved, gradually, from local legend into historical consciousness, though it remains less well known outside Germany than many other episodes of the Eastern Front's final phase. There is something instructive in this delayed recognition. It suggests that memory does not arrive all at once, but settles over time, building in layers. The forest around Halbe became, in a sense, a kind of archive itself. Walking through the woods today, one might encounter markers that identify former command posts, routes of retreat, the locations of Soviet blocking positions. Modern hikers and history enthusiasts trace the paths that soldiers walked 75 years ago, and in doing so, they participate in a form of remembrance that is neither nationalistic nor purely academic, but genuinely contemplative. They are asking, in their quiet way, what happened here, and why it mattered, and what it means to us now. The war cemetery at Halbe serves as the focal point for a larger conversation about reconciliation. Unlike many European cemeteries dedicated to World War II, the Halbe site has become a place where German, Russian, and international visitors come together. Some memorials emphasize the shared humanity of soldiers caught in an impossible situation. Others recognize the Soviet sacrifices that were necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. The dialogue is delicate, always. because the history of the Eastern Front cannot be separated from the ideology that began the war, the atrocities that were committed, and the immense moral complexity of remembering without either sanitizing or sensationalizing. Yet the effort to create space for that conversation, to allow both mourning and historical honesty, represents something worth noting. In recent years, particularly since the early 2000s, the Halbe Pocket has attracted increasing attention from military historians and from those interested in understanding the specific mechanics of encirclement, breakout, and the desperate endgame of armies that know they have lost. Documentary filmmakers have visited the site, universities have organized field studies. The quiet significance of those final weeks of April 1945 has emerged from obscurity not because the story has changed, but because the post-war world has finally created enough distance and enough stability to examine it with something approaching calm. There is no triumphalism in this remembrance, nor should there be. What remains is simply the acknowledgement that thousands of men died here, in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty and confusion, and that this history deserves to be known, studied, and honored, without the distortions of propaganda or the erasure of inconvenient truths. The forest south of Berlin exists differently now, where the sound of tracked vehicles once shredded the spring air, where artillery fire had turned the pines themselves into splinters and ash. There is only the ordinary whisper of wind through restored woodland. 79 years have passed since the earth was torn and stained, and the Spreewald has returned to what it knows best, a quiet place of water and shadow, of moss, and the patient work of growing things. If you were to walk there on an evening in late spring, as the light falls at that particular angle when the day surrenders slowly to dusk, you would notice very little of what happened. The forest does not advertise its wounds. The trees that stand now were often saplings when the war ended, or they grew from seeds that had fallen during those terrible weeks of April. The soft forest floor, thick with needles and decomposing leaves, has no memory written upon it that your foot could read. And yet, if you knew where to look, if someone had told you about the places, the clearing near Halbe where mass graves were dug, the ridge where Soviet artillery had been positioned, the narrow track where the breakout columns had struggled through the darkness, you might sense something in the quality of the silence. Not a haunting, precisely, something quieter than that, an attentiveness perhaps, a way in which the place seems to hold itself differently than an unmarked forest might. The modern war cemetery sits among the trees with a kind of peaceful integration that seems to have come slowly over the decades. Stone markers, arranged with the same careful geometry that military burials demand, yet surrounded by the random generosity of the forest, moss creeping across the base of monuments, young saplings growing between the rows, birds nesting in the spaces above. The names carved there are from every year of the war, but many of them are from those final days in April when the Ninth Army's soldiers were trying to fight their way toward a salvation that kept receding before them like a tide that would not return. Some of the graves are marked with the names of Soviet soldiers too, those who died in the fighting around the pocket. In the long years since the war, the cemetery has become a place where people from both nations have come to remember, to lay flowers in spring, to stand in the quality of light that filters through pine branches and remember the young men who did not walk out of this forest. But on most evenings, there are no visitors. The forest is largely alone with itself, and with the accumulated weight of what happened there, held lightly now, like something settling into soil. There is a particular quality to dusk in a pine forest, a deepening of the blue, a cooling of the air, a gradual softening of all the distinct edges that the day had insisted upon. The light, which moments before had seemed clear and distinct, becomes diffuse, impressionistic. The shapes of the trees remain, but seem to lose their urgency. The far edge of any clearing becomes uncertain, almost dreamlike, and in this gathering darkness, the ordinary sounds of the forest intensify, not because they are louder, but because there is less light to distract from them, a branch shifting, the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush, the sound of wind moving through the canopy, which is not a single sound at all, but many sounds layered upon one another, each one slightly different in pitch and rhythm from the others. If you were to sit still in that forest at night, allowing your eyes to adjust, you would find that the darkness is not absolute. The forest at night is never truly dark. There is starlight, filtering through the canopy in fragments. There is the faint phosphorescence of decomposing matter on the forest floor, the way certain fungi and organisms emit their own quiet light. There is the occasional reflection from a stream or a pool of accumulated rainwater. And as your eyes adjusted, as your other senses began to compensate for the diminishment of sight, you would become aware of a kind of gentleness in the darkness, a quality that is almost protective. The forest at night does not feel threatening. It feels like a place that has learned to hold its own history and has decided to do so quietly, without drama. The streams that wind through the Spreewald continue to flow, as they have flowed for thousands of years before the war, and as they continue to flow after it. Water is perhaps the most patient of all elements. It does not keep count of what it has carried past. Bodies, debris, blood, all of it moves downstream, and eventually is absorbed into the larger river systems, distributed so widely that no single molecule retains the significance it once had. The water that flows through the forest now is clean. The Spreewald is a place where people fish again, where children play by the banks in summer, where the water reflects the sky and the trees, exactly as it must have when no one was fighting there. Does that mean the past has been erased? Not entirely, but it has been transformed. It has become part of something larger, something that continues, something that does not end. There are memorials throughout the region, plaques and stones marking where specific units fought, where significant losses occurred, where civilians were killed or died in the chaos of the collapse. But what is perhaps more striking is the sheer ordinariness that has returned. Farms operate on land where Wehrmacht and Soviet units were dug in. Roads have been rebuilt. Small towns have rebuilt their centers, their churches, their shops. People live there who were born after the war, who know about those April days the way people know about the distant past, as history, as something important to understand and remember, but not as something they have lived through. And yet their lives are lived on the same ground, under the same sky, with the same seasons turning as they have always turned. The spring that comes to the Spreewald now brings the same renewal it has always brought. The frost retreats, the trees bud out, the air warms, flowers open. Life, which had been held in suspension through the winter, expands again. And this happens every year, regardless of what happened 79 years ago, regardless of what is happening anywhere else in the world. The forest does not wait to be forgiven. It does not demand that we understand or acknowledge what happened there. It simply continues. It grows. It extends itself into the future with the patient insistence of living things. When darkness falls completely in the Spreewald now, when the last light has drained from the western sky and the stars have emerged fully, there is a sense of profound peace that settles over the woodland. Not the peace of oblivion, not a forgetting, but rather a peace that has come through the passage of time, through the work of growth and decay and renewal, through the arrival and departure of thousands upon thousands of ordinary days. The forest breathes. The small creatures that live in it continue their small lives. The earth beneath the moss and needles continues to hold everything that has ever fallen into it, the ancient, the recent, the forgotten, the still remembered. It holds it all, without distinction, without judgment, simply as part of the accumulation of years. This is what remains of the Halbe Pocket, not the dramatic climax of a historical moment, not the crisis of the breakout, not the desperation and the loss. What remains is this: a forest